Welcome to Bald Voldemort. Today's adventure: what if Harry's Lord-Heir magic at age 9 forced Voldemort's followers out of 47 Wizengamot seats? If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The birthday magic. The kitchen at number 4, Privet Drive smelled of bacon fat that had been left in the pan too long, of the lemon dish soap Aunt Petunia bought in the larger size to save tuppence, and very faintly of the dust Harry had not yet been told to clean. It was the morning of his 9th birthday. He had not been told that either. He had worked it out from the calendar on the side of the refrigerator, where his cousin Dudley's birthday was circled in red felt tip, and his own date was a small square space that nobody had drawn anything on. He sat under the table, where he had been told to sit, because the chair he had been allowed to use for the last 6 weeks had been moved to the dining room for guests who were not coming until Saturday. From under the table he could see Aunt Petunia's ankles, her thin tendons pulling and slackening as she rose on her toes to reach the tea caddy on the top shelf, and the cuff of Uncle Vernon's trousers, which had a small grease spot on the right turnip that Petunia had been meaning to point out and had not yet, because she was angry about a different thing. He was thirsty. He had been thirsty for some time. The cup of water he had taken from the tap the night before had been spilled on the way upstairs because Dudley had stuck out a foot on the landing, and Harry had not been allowed back down to refill it on grounds that he had been wasteful. He could ask now. He decided, weighing the shapes of Petunia's mouth that he had learned to read, that he should not ask now. "Vernon," Petunia said, in the careful, measured voice she used when she had been thinking about something for a while and had reached a conclusion she wanted Vernon to feel he had reached himself. The boy took bread out of the bin. The kettle had not yet whistled. Harry, under the table, looked at his hands. He had taken bread out of the bin. He had taken half a stale crust from the very back, the part that had gone hard along its edge, and he had eaten it standing in the pantry doorway with his ear cocked because he had been hungry enough that the sound of his own chewing had felt loud. "He what?" Uncle Vernon said. "The crust," Petunia said. "The end piece, the one I was saving." This was, Harry noted, not technically a lie. Petunia had not been saving the crust. Petunia had been intending to feed the crust to the birds on the lawn after church on Sunday, which was the same thing as saving it in the way she counted, because in Petunia's reckoning a thing she had decided about was a thing she had done. "Out," Vernon said. He had risen, his bulk swinging the chair he had been sitting on a half-inch back from the table. The chair leg scraped. "Out from under that table this instant, boy." Harry came out from under the table. He had learned the geometry of this, the angles you had to keep. If you stayed low, Vernon's hands were slower than his voice. If you stayed against the wall, Vernon's arm would knock the wall once and stop. If you let yourself be pinned against the counter where the kitchen towels hung, the towels could be pulled down and pretended it later, when Petunia wanted to make a story about cleaning. Vernon was between him and the wall. There was no geometry today. "You will," Vernon said, his face the color of the cheap red wine Petunia bought for her sister's visits. "Tell me precisely what you took, and you will tell me where you put what you did not finish, and you will tell me when, and you will tell me why. And so help me, boy, if I find one crumb of evidence that you have been at any other thing in this house you have not earned." The kettle whistled. Petunia did not move to take it off. The whistle climbed in the way kettles climb, the pitch sharpening, the metal of the spout vibrating, and for one extraordinary second Harry heard inside the whistle a second sound, lower, like a bell being struck once underwater. He thought it was inside his own head. He thought, in a quick narrow way that he did not have the words for yet, that perhaps he was about to faint, and he wondered very practically whether he would hit the cupboard handle on the way down, and whether the cut on his temple would be the kind Petunia would explain by saying he had been clumsy. The bell sounded again. It was not inside his head. Vernon's hand came down on his shoulder. It closed, and it was meant to close harder. It did not close harder. Vernon's hand stopped, half an inch from Harry's collarbone, and went still in a way that hands do not go. Harry watched it, a hand the size and weight and color of a small Sunday roast, stopped at a precise distance from his skin, the broad, blunt thumb fixed in the air as though pressed against a pane of glass that was not there. "What," said Uncle Vernon very calmly, "is the matter with you, boy?" It was not phrased as a question. It was phrased as a sentence with a full stop. Harry did not answer. He could not have answered. Something behind his ribs had unlatched. He felt it physically, the way you feel a coat button popping off when you have tugged the coat too sharply. A small clean tearing somewhere central, and then a slackness, and then a flooding warmth that ran down the inside of his arms and out of the ends of his fingers and into the space where Vernon's hand had stopped. The kettle screamed. Petunia, alarmed at the kettle and not at her husband, finally moved. She lifted the kettle off the hob. The whistle died. In the silence that followed, Harry heard, with a clarity that puzzled him, the second bell. It came not from any direction in the kitchen. It came from a direction he had not previously known existed. The way you do not know the back of your own neck is a direction until someone touches it. The bell rang there, low and large, and it rang in the rhythm of a name being called. 3 strokes, a pause, 3 strokes again. Vernon's hand was still in the air. Vernon's hand, Harry saw now, had begun to whiten at the fingertips. "Vernon," Petunia said. Her voice had gone careful again, that other carefulness, the kind she used when she was afraid and did not want him to know she was. "Vernon, your hand." Vernon tried to pull his hand back. His hand did not move. There is a particular dignity that very large, frightened men preserve for as long as they can. Vernon preserved his for perhaps 4 seconds. Then his mouth opened, and a sound came out of it that was not a word. The third stroke of the bell, the third pause, the third triple. The kitchen filled with a smell that was not in the kitchen. It was the smell of cold stone and of polished brass and of something Harry would later come to recognize as old paper kept dry by old magic. A square of the kitchen floor went away. It did not disappear. It folded. The linoleum and the boards under it folded inward like the corner of a letter being turned down, and out of the fold rose a small, neat creature in a high-collared coat. The creature was the color of new pewter and the size of a child, and it carried under one arm a leather portfolio with brass corners. It bowed once from the waist, with the slight extra dip that the goblin nation reserves for the heads of houses to whom they have, at some point in the past, sworn the carrying of certain duties. "Lord-Heir Potter," it said. Its voice was not loud. Its voice did not have to be loud. "Gringotts greets you. I am to escort you to the solicitor of your houses. Will you come?" It was, Harry would think later, the politest thing he had ever been asked. He looked at Uncle Vernon, who was making the not-word sound. He looked at Aunt Petunia, whose hands had risen to her cheeks in the precise mannered way of a woman in a photograph of a fainting. He looked at the goblin courier, who was waiting with the patience of a being whose people had been waiting for 9 years already and could wait 9 seconds more. "Yes," Harry said. The bell rang once more. The kitchen folded the rest of the way around him and was gone. The floor of the Gringotts antechamber was black marble with a vein of gold so fine it caught the gaslight only when you walked over it, and only then by trick of the eye, so that you were never quite sure whether the floor or your shoe was responsible. The ceiling was low and arched, and the gas mantles were set in iron sconces shaped like wolves' heads, the flame coming out of each mouth in a small, steady tongue. Harry, standing on the marble in shoes that had once been Dudley's, felt the warmth of the kitchen drain out of him and a different warmth take its place. This one was not in his arms. It was at the small of his back, behind his sternum, and behind his eyes, 3 little weights he had not known he had carried, settling. The goblin courier was already moving. Harry followed, because he had been told to follow grown-ups all his life and had not yet been given a better instruction. They went through a door that did not have a handle, a door that opened because the courier touched the lintel, and they came into a room with a long table of dark wood and a single chair on the near side of the table, and a stand-up reading lectern on the far side of the table, at which there stood a goblin perhaps 2 heads taller than the courier and a great deal more deliberately dressed. This goblin wore a black coat with a high stiff collar, charcoal underrobes, and at his throat a chain of office in 3 linked metals, copper, silver, gold. His hands rested on the lectern, on the open ledger there, with the particular flat stillness of hands that had recently been doing precise work and would shortly do more. He looked up. He did not bow. He inclined his head the smallest measurable degree, the way one might salute a peer one has not yet been formally introduced to. "Lord-Heir Potter," he said, "I am Bonebreaker, senior solicitor to your 4 houses. Sit." Harry sat. The chair was the right size for him, which surprised him. The chair, he understood vaguely, had been brought in at some point in the last several minutes, because someone in this room or somewhere near this room had been told to expect a child of his height. Bonebreaker turned a page of the ledger. He did not look at Harry while he did it. "You will have questions," he said. "I will dispatch the urgent first. You are now the legal head of 4 houses. House Potter you knew about. House Peveril you did not, because the line was thought extinct on the female side and was not. House Black by cousin claim through your paternal grandmother, contingent and now solidified because the senior heir of House Black is in Azkaban without trial and his magic is not at present competent to refuse you. House Gryffindor by direct descent through the Peveril female line. 4 houses, 4 seats on the high bench. You did not request this. Magic does not require your consent. It requires only your survival to your 9th year and a sufficient stimulus." He turned another page. "You provided the stimulus this morning." Harry, who had not yet been offered water and did not yet feel he could ask, said, "What is the stimulus?" He had meant to ask something else. He was tired and very thirsty, and there was a small flat tone in his voice he did not recognize as his own. Bonebreaker looked up properly for the first time. His eyes were the color of slate after rain. They held on Harry for what felt like a count of 3. "The stimulus," he said, "is a head of house under the age of magical majority being placed in fear of death or grievous harm by a non-magical person within a household in which his guardianship is, by ancient custom, defective. The charters call it the awakening clause. It exists because 800 years ago a lord of house, Selwyn, was murdered at 6 by a Muggle uncle for an inheritance, and the surviving Selwyns went to war until the last Muggle in 3 counties was gone, and the Goblin Nation and the High Council agreed that there should never again be a circumstance in which a child of a house could die unawakened. The charter wrote itself. We have kept it for 812 years. It has activated 19 times. You are the 20th. Harry took this in. He was 9. He understood approximately a third of what had been said. He understood that he had been about to be hurt. He understood that he had not been hurt. He understood that the hand on his shoulder had stopped at a precise distance from his collarbone and had not been able to close. "It stopped him," he said. "It stopped him," Bonebreaker agreed. "Awakening magic in a head of house under 9 years is reactive. It cannot kill. It cannot maim. It will hold, for as long as is necessary, the hand that meant the harm. Your uncle's hand will release in approximately 17 minutes from now. He will have feeling restored in approximately 3 hours. He will not enter the same room as you for the rest of his natural life. I have already issued the writ. You have other concerns." Harry, who had not known he had other concerns, said, "I am thirsty." Bonebreaker did not smile. Bonebreaker did not, by reputation, smile. He did reach beside the lectern in a single smooth motion and lift from a small brass tray a glass of water that had been poured before Harry arrived, and he set the glass on the table within reach of Harry's hand. Harry drank. The water was very cold and tasted of a kind of stone he had not previously drunk from. He finished the glass. He put it down. He looked at Bonebreaker. "You said other concerns," he said. "I did." Bonebreaker laid both his hands flat on the open page of the ledger. "My lord, the magic that awakened in you this morning is, in its first hour, omnidirectional. It does not stop at your uncle's hand. It reaches outward along every line of magical contract that touches the houses you now lead. There are a great many such lines. Most are dormant. A small number are not. One in particular, which the charters of the High Bench have maintained continuously since the year 941, is active in this hour, and it has reported." Harry waited. "The charter," Bonebreaker said, "is the charter of the free vote. It holds that a vote cast in the High Council under magical coercion is not a vote, and that the seat from which such a vote has been cast is, until the coercion is removed, void. The charter has no enforcement mechanism of its own. It waits, as charters wait, for a head of house with sufficient ancient blood to walk into a room and want to know. You walked in. You wanted to know. He turned the ledger. He turned it through the air, across the table, so that the open page faced Harry. The page had a line of fine black script along its top. Below the line of script there were names. The names were in a list. Harry counted in the way of a child who knows how to count and does not yet know how to skim. The names came in fours down the page, and the page was full, and there was a small mark in the lower right of the page that Harry, having seen marks like it on other ledgers in other lives, identified as a sign that more pages followed. He counted to 40. He looked up. There are more, he said. There are 47, Bonebreaker said. Each name on these pages holds a seat on the high bench. Each name is, at this hour, under an active Imperius mark. Some of the marks are recent, some are very old. One has been carried for 19 years. The charter does not distinguish. The charter holds them void. Harry looked at the names. He recognized 3. He had heard them spoken on Aunt Petunia's wireless in the long evenings when she had thought he was asleep in his cupboard, and he had not been asleep in his cupboard. Malfoy. Not Avery. What happens now? He said. At dawn, Bonebreaker said, the clerk of the Wizengamot will dispatch 47 sealed writs to 47 manor houses. Each writ will inform the recipient that, by the operation of the Charter of the Free Vote, the recipient's seat has been voided pending the removal of the magical coercion under which the seat has been held. The recipient will have 90 days to demonstrate to a panel of 3 senior solicitors that no such coercion exists. The recipient will, in approximately 100% of these cases, fail to demonstrate any such thing. The high bench, which has had a quiet majority of Death Eater sympathizers since the year before your parents died, will lose that majority in the course of a single morning. By the time the bells of Gringotts ring noon, the wizarding political landscape of Britain will have been changed without a wand having been drawn. By you. By the fact that you wanted water and your aunt would not give it to you, and your uncle came at you over a stale crust. Bonebreaker closed the ledger. Now, he said, we will discuss what you would like to do with this. In the manor at Wiltshire, in a study paneled in dark walnut, with a fire that had been lit by a house elf at 5 that morning and a tea service that had been laid out at 5:30 and not yet touched, Lucius Malfoy was reading correspondence. He had risen, as he always rose, at 5:45. He had bathed, dressed, and descended to the study at 6. His routine was a thing he prided himself on. His father, he was fond of remarking to those few who could be trusted with the remark, had risen at 6 and had therefore arrived at his desk at 6:15, which his father had called punctuality and which Lucius had privately considered a tardy man's idea of a brisk start. He was reading a note from the minister, which he disliked. The minister wrote in a hand like a child's. Cornelius could not be persuaded, even by gentle correction, to use the proper salutations. The ring on Lucius's left fourth finger went cold. He noticed it before he understood it. The ring was, by old enchantment, kept always at the temperature of his hand. It was the seal of the Malfoy seat. He had worn it since his father's death. It had never been less than warm. It was, now, the temperature of the marble windowsill, which was the temperature of the inside of a wine cellar in February. Lucius put down the minister's note. He looked at the ring. The ring, beneath his cuff, had gone a shade lighter, the gold turning very slightly silver at the rim, the way an autumn leaf at the moment of frost goes briefly 2 colors at once and then settles to the new color. He did not, at this point, panic. He had not been raised to panic, and he had not, in his 37 years, been given sufficient cause. He rose. He went to the bell-pull. He pulled twice, sharply, which was the signal to bring up his solicitor on the flue at once, regardless of the hour. The solicitor's head appeared in the fire within 90 seconds. The solicitor's face was the color of a man who had been up since 4 because the news had reached his office before it had reached the manor. "My Lord Malfoy," the solicitor said. "Speak," said Lucius. The solicitor spoke. Lucius listened. Lucius's expression did not change, because Lucius's expression did not change in front of subordinates. His expression had not changed at his father's funeral. It had not changed during certain conversations with the Dark Lord in 1979 which had concerned the disposition of a particular Muggle village. It would not change now, in front of a man he paid 60 galleons a month to bring him bad news quickly and discreetly. When the solicitor had finished, Lucius said, "His name?" "Potter," said the solicitor. "The boy, he is 9 years old today. The awakening clause has triggered. The charter of the free vote has activated. We will receive the writ at dawn, as will 46 others." Lucius stood for a moment with one hand on the mantel. Then he turned slowly and he said, "My father would have called this a temporary inconvenience." "My lord," said the solicitor carefully, "your father did not live to see." "My father," Lucius said, "would have called this a temporary inconvenience, and my father would have been correct. The boy is 9. A boy of 9 cannot hold a council floor. The charters require sittings, motions, seconds. The boy will be advised. The boy will be advised by goblins. We have, between dawn and the first sitting, a margin." He looked at the ring on his finger. It was the temperature of stone. "We will use the margin." The solicitor said, "Yes, my lord." "You will return to your office," Lucius said, "and you will draft me, by noon, a list of every sitting member whose seat is not on those 47 pages and whose vote is, by any margin, still purchasable. You will also draft a second list. You will list every member who is on those 47 pages and whose mark, if it could be quietly lifted within the 90 days, would restore the seat. You will mark on that list which of those marks were laid by the Dark Lord personally and which were laid by his lieutenants. The Dark Lord's marks cannot, at present, be lifted. The lieutenant's marks can. You will mark accordingly." "Yes, my lord." "You will not," Lucius said, "be observed entering or leaving the office of any member on either list today or any day. You will use intermediaries. You will use intermediaries whose own seats are not on the 47. "Yes, my lord." The solicitor's head withdrew from the fire. The fire returned to its ordinary flicker. Lucius stood at the mantel for a few moments more. He took the ring from his finger. It was the first time in 8 years he had taken it off. The skin beneath was paler than the skin around it, and a fine groove ran where the ring had sat. He held the ring up to the light from the window. The light came through the window pane and fell on the gold, and the gold did not warm. He put the ring down on the mantel, very gently, the way one puts down a small dead bird that one intends to bury later in the day. He went back to his desk. He picked up the minister's note. He began to read it again, from the salutation, attending to it now in a different way. By 10:30 in the morning, Cornelius Fudge had been informed, had instructed his secretary that he was unavailable to all callers, had locked the door of his office, had unlocked the door of his office, had asked his secretary if there had been any callers, had been told there had been 17, had relocked the door, had drunk a glass of fire whiskey, had vomited the fire whiskey into the brass urn intended for ashes from his pipe, had cleaned the urn himself rather than let his secretary see, and had begun to compose, in his own hand, with several false starts, a letter to the chief warlock requesting an emergency briefing on a procedural matter that he, the minister, had not yet had the opportunity to fully consider. At Hogwarts, Albus Dumbledore was in his office. He had been at his desk since 7. The list of voided seats had reached him at 7:20 by patronus from his agent in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and he had been reading the list at 7:25, and he had been still reading the list at 9. He read slowly when the matter was grave. He had read this list 4 times by 9. He was reading it again now at 10:32. He laid the list flat on his desk. He took off his half-moon spectacles. He set the spectacles on top of the list. He pinched the bridge of his nose between thumb and forefinger, where the spectacles had rested, and he said, very softly, to the room, "Oh." It was not a sound of dismay. It was not, precisely, a sound of pleasure. It was the sound of an old man who has just realized that a plan he had been quietly carrying for 9 years has been overtaken, by a wider margin than he had thought possible, by a child whose welfare he had been quietly mismanaging for almost the same 9 years. Fawkes, on his perch, gave a single soft chime of a note. The chime hung in the air for a moment and went out. Dumbledore replaced his spectacles. He drew a sheet of parchment toward him. He uncapped the small bottle of ink at his elbow. He began to write a letter. The letter was very short. It said, "To Senior Solicitor Bonebreaker, with my respect. I understand that the affairs of a young gentleman of my acquaintance have, this morning, been placed in your capable hands. I would be grateful for the courtesy of an audience with him at his earliest convenience and, of course, at his pleasure. I do not write as his magical guardian, an office I no longer hold. I write as the headmaster of the school he will, in 2 years, attend, and as one of those many wizards whose work on the high bench has, this morning, been complicated to a degree that I find I cannot yet measure. I would not presume to ask him to come to me. I will come to him. Yours in the trust of the work, A.P.W.B. Dumbledore." He read the letter. He folded it once. He sealed it with a drop of wax from a candle he kept lit on his desk for the purpose, and he pressed the seal of his office on the wax, and he rang the small bell beside the candle, and a school owl came to the window. "To Gringotts," Dumbledore said. "To the solicitor. Wait for a reply." The owl took the letter and was gone. Dumbledore sat back in his chair. He looked at the list on his desk. 6 of the names on the list he had known to be on the list. 12 of the names he had suspected. 29 of the names, including the names of 3 men he had been confident, on the morning of his last breakfast, of being able to whip on a close question of magical education funding, he had not. His own block, he understood now, had been hollowed for years. Some of the hollowing had been done in front of him. Some of the hollowing he had even noticed and had attributed to other causes, to age, to drink, to one man's marriage and another man's loss of one. He had been wrong about each of them. He had been wrong about the marriage and the loss, and he had been wrong about the block, and he had been wrong, longest and most expensively, about the boy. He picked up his spectacles again. He did not put them on. He held them in his hand and he looked through them, without looking through them, at the bright window beyond his desk. "Well," he said. Fawkes chimed. In a stone cell on the highest tier of Azkaban, behind a door of black iron through which no light passed, Bellatrix Lestrange opened her eyes. She had been asleep, in the manner that the prisoners of the highest tier slept, which was not sleep, but a thing that the Dementors permitted in exchange for the parts of a mind they did not yet care to take. She woke because something had moved in her left hand, which was the hand on which she wore no rings any longer, the hand from which the Aurors had pulled her wedding band and her family's signet in the receiving room 10 years ago. There was no ring on the hand. There was, instead, a coldness in the place a ring had been, a coldness that ran a small, bright line up the bones of her finger and into her wrist, the way an icicle drawn slowly along the skin will mark its passage in a thin, neat thread. Bellatrix sat up on the stone shelf that served as a bed. She held the hand up in front of her face. The cell was very dark. She could not see the hand. She did not need to see it. She could feel the line of cold, and she could feel it stopping at her elbow, and she could feel, very precisely, what it meant. A seat she had voted 4 times in absentia, by proxy through her husband's solicitor, by an old enchantment the Lestrange estate had paid for and renewed at every quarter day for 19 years, had ceased to be a seat she could vote. She laughed. The laugh climbed in her throat in 3 small ascending notes and came out into the cell as a single high-sustained sound that the Dementor at the end of the corridor did not understand and did not approach. "Oh," she said to the dark. "Oh, but who? Who, little wizard with a finger cold as mine, who has done this clever thing?" She did not know. She would know. She lay back down on the stone shelf with her cold hand pressed against her cheek, and she sang to herself very softly, a nursery rhyme her mother had sung to her sister Andromeda, and that she, Bellatrix, had taken into her own mouth when Andromeda had stopped being a sister, a rhyme about a clever boy and a clever wolf, and which of them ate the other in the end. She had always liked the wolf. She would like, she thought, to find out which the little wizard was. In Bonebreaker's office, on the 7th sublevel of Gringotts, the gas mantles had been turned down a notch. Bonebreaker had observed, with the part of him that observed children at all, that the boy was beginning to slump. Magic had been generous to him this morning, and the body of a 9-year-old has only so much capacity for being generously visited. "Lord-Heir Potter," Bonebreaker said, "we will continue tomorrow. You will sleep in a room above this one. The room is yours and was prepared. A meal will be brought. You will not return to the house in Surrey. The writ removing you from your aunt and uncle's custody was lodged at 9:06 this morning. I have not yet told you this because the more urgent matters were before us. I am telling you this now. There is no scenario in which you go back. Do you understand? Harry, who had been at the edge of falling asleep at the table, gathered himself and looked at the goblin. I understand, he said. There will be a great deal, Bonebreaker said, that you will be asked tomorrow and the day after and the week after and the year after. The houses you lead require decisions. The high bench, beginning at dawn, will be in upheaval. You will be the cause of the upheaval. You will be 9 years old. You will not be alone. I am solicitor to your houses. There will be a tutor in the room next to yours by tomorrow noon. There will be a healer at your bedside if you so much as cough. Do you understand? Yes, Harry said. One more matter, said Bonebreaker. He had risen. He stood now with one hand on the closed ledger and the other at his side. There are wizards who, in the course of this morning and the days following, will wish to come to you. They will come because they fear you, or because they wish to befriend you in case fear should be more useful later. They will say they come as friends of your parents. Some will be telling the truth. Most will not. You will let me sort them. You will not let any of them be alone with you, even Dumbledore, until I have read them. Do you understand? Harry, who had not known Dumbledore was a name he should hear in this room, and was not entirely surprised that it was, said, I understand. Good, said Bonebreaker. Sleep. Harry got down from the chair. He was carried to a small lift by a goblin he had not seen before. The lift went up 2 floors and stopped. He was led along a corridor of warm stone and into a room with a bed and a washstand and a chair and a high small window through which he could see, at a great height, the dome of the Goblin Bank from inside, and beyond the dome, faintly, the underside of London. He did not undress. He sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at his hands. The warmth at the small of his back and behind his sternum and behind his eyes was still there. It had settled to a steady low ember. He lay down. He turned his face to the wall. The wall was warm. The wall, he understood vaguely, had been warmed by the same magic that had warmed the floor of the corridor, and the warmth had been calibrated to the temperature of his skin. He slept. At dawn the next morning, the Wizengamot clerk, an elderly witch named Augusta Boot, who had served 3 chief warlocks and outlived 2 of them, rose from her desk in the lower antechamber of the ministry, walked to the writ cabinet, and unlocked the lower drawer with a key she kept on a chain at her neck. From the drawer, she drew 47 sealed parchments, each addressed in the small, severe hand of a senior solicitor of Gringotts. She set the parchments on her desk. She arranged them in order of seniority of the seats they would void. She looked at the top parchment for a long moment. It was addressed to the 11th seat, in the second row of the old bench, to the Right Honourable Lord Malfoy of Wiltshire. Augusta Boot, who had voted against Malfoy on every motion that had come to a roll call vote in the last 6 years, and had been thwarted by him on every motion that had not, allowed herself, in the privacy of the lower antechamber, the smallest of smiles. It was perhaps 3/8 of a smile. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then she rang the dispatch bell. The bell rang in the upper office. A second clerk entered. Augusta handed him the parchments. The clerk took them, bowed, and went out. By 7 of the clock that morning, the first of the 47 writs had been delivered, by owl, to the breakfast table of Lord Malfoy of Wiltshire, who was sitting with his ring on the mantel and his cup of tea cooling at his elbow, and who took the writ with one hand and broke its seal with the other, and read it through twice, and folded it, and placed it under the saucer of his cup, and rang for fresh tea. By 8, all 47 had been delivered. By 9, the news had reached the prophet, which began to set its noon edition in larger type than was customary. By 10, in his office above the city, the senior solicitor of the houses of Potter, Black, Peveril, and Gryffindor was writing, on a fresh sheet of parchment, the first of a great many letters that would, in the months to come, change the shape of the wizarding world. The boy whose magic had begun all of it was asleep, in a room above that office, with his face turned to a warm wall. He had not yet been told that he had won. He would not be told for some time. Some victories are best understood slowly. Chapter 2. The architect's briefing. Harry woke into a room that was the wrong temperature for cold and the wrong shape for the cupboard. And for half a heartbeat, he had the practiced moment of stillness that he had developed for years in the cupboard under the stairs. The stillness in which a small boy listens for the breathing of a larger person and decides what he is allowed to do. The room offered him no breathing to listen to. The room offered him stone walls, a high small window into which a thin bar of London morning had begun to leak, the smell of clean linen, and on a tray beside the bed, a covered dish from which the heat had been preserved by a charm. He lay still for a while. He listened anyway. He could not stop himself. He listened to the building. The building made the small noises that buildings make when they have been worked on by enchantment for centuries. A slow, clean settling, like the breathing of a stone animal that does not need to be afraid. He sat up. He took the cover off the dish. There was porridge with cream, a soft-boiled egg, 3 slices of bread that had been buttered on both sides, and an apple cut into the precise quarters that someone had thought a 9-year-old could manage without help. There was also a glass of water. The water had been poured fresh. There was no condensation on the inside of the glass. He ate. He ate slowly, the way he had taught himself to eat in the cupboard, because if you ate slowly, the food felt longer in your mouth. He ate the porridge first, the egg second, the bread third, and the apple last. He drank the water at the end. When he had finished, a goblin came in. It was not the courier of the morning before, and it was not Bonebreaker. This goblin was small and thin, with a brass pince-nez clipped to its nose, and a fold of red cloth at its collar that Harry did not yet know was the sign of a tutor of the second rank. It carried a small tray on which there sat a fresh shirt, a fresh pair of trousers, and a pair of shoes that, when Harry tried them on, were exactly his size. "My lord," the goblin said, "when you have dressed, the solicitor will receive you. There is no hurry, you have today." "I have today," Harry repeated slowly to make sure he had understood. He had not been told he had a day before. He had had pieces of days. He had had quarters of hours. "You have today and the day after and as many days as are required," the goblin said. "I am Reedstrike. I am your tutor in the formalities. I will not teach you magic. I am not competent to teach you magic. I will teach you which fork to pick up and which seat to take when one is offered and which letter to open first. You will find these useful very soon." Harry dressed. The clothes fit. The shoes did not pinch. He looked at himself in a small mirror on the washstand. He looked thin, which he had always looked, and he looked tired, which he had also always looked, and he looked in a way he could not name, as though someone had set him down on the right shelf at last. The light around his head in the mirror was not different. The face was the same. The shelf was different. He went out. Bonebreaker's office was warmer in the morning than it had been at night. The fire in the grate had been built up to a small, steady blaze, the gas mantles had been brought up half a notch, and the ledger on the lectern had been replaced by a different ledger, a thicker one, bound in dark green leather and stamped with the 4 crests of the houses of which Harry was now head. Bonebreaker stood at the lectern. He had not, Harry suspected, slept. The white of his linen collar was as crisp as the night before, and his chain of office hung in the same precise loop. But his eyes had taken on the particular flatness that the eyes of certain professionals take when they have been kept open for a great many hours by the importance of the thing they have been doing. "My lord," he said. "Sit." Harry sat. "We have," Bonebreaker said, "in the last 14 hours, accomplished the following. Your removal from the custody of your aunt and uncle is complete. The writ was filed at 6 minutes past 9 yesterday morning. The Ministry's Department of Magical Education and Welfare countersigned at 4. The Muggle Local Authority was notified at 5. The Muggle Local Authority has, as Muggle local authorities will, accepted a letter from a solicitor in London claiming jurisdiction, by way of a grey tuncle they will never have heard of, and they have closed the file. You are not, in any record they will consult, a child they need to know about. Your aunt and uncle have been given a packet of instructions which they will follow, because the packet was delivered by a man in a gray suit whose face they will not be able to describe afterwards. They will not speak of you. They will not write of you. They will not, if asked, remember the cupboard. Harry, who had not been asked about a cupboard and had not mentioned a cupboard, sat very still. You did not need to know that I knew about the cupboard, Bonebreaker said, without looking up from the ledger. You know now. I tell you because there is to be no discovery later, my lord. There is no part of your life that has not been read. I do not say this to alarm you. I say this so that you do not need to spend any of your attention in the months to come on the question of what other people may someday find out. There will be no else for them to find. The whole record is already inside this building. The whole record is already mine. He turned a page of the new ledger. Second matter, he said. The Lestrange seat. He paused. He looked up. He looked at Harry briefly, with that flatness which had something behind it that was not flat. By the operation of the charter that activated yesterday, he said, the seat held by Bellatrix Lestrange, born Bellatrix Black, is now formally void. She is a proxy holder of the black vote through a chain of 3 solicitors that her husband arranged at his marriage, and which she has, by virtue of being a black, been permitted to exercise from her cell. The chain has been broken. The seat has been frozen. The estates which underwrite the seat are at this hour without an active head, and the law of underwriting estates says that an underwriting estate without an active head reverts, for the period of the freeze, to the trust of the senior cousin line of the house. The senior cousin line of the House of Black is you. The Lestrange estates have, accordingly, reverted to you. Harry, who had eaten porridge and an apple and had not yet been 5 hours awake, took this in. What are the estates? He said. Land, said Bonebreaker. A manor near Belper which has not been opened in 11 years. A second manor in Inverness which has been let to a tobacconist's widow for the past 5 years, and which she has neglected unfortunately, though not malevolently. Gold to the value of 41,000 galleons. A library that is, in parts, very interesting, and, in other parts, the sort of thing that no house should be permitted to own without a goblin observer in residence. A wand collection that includes, among other items, 3 wands which have been confiscated for being too heavily ensorcelled to be safely handled by any wizard but the wizard who ensorcelled them, all of whom are now dead. The Aurors took the wands at the time of Bellatrix Lestrange's arrest, and the Aurors have kept them in a vault on the 3rd sublevel of the ministry, but the deeds are yours. What can I do with the estates? Harry said. That, said Bonebreaker, is the question you ought to ask before any other, and the question your tutor will tell you to ask of 100 other things in the year to come. I will give you the answer that the solicitor of your houses gives to the boy of 9 who has asked it. You can do anything with the estates that is not a crime. That is not a violation of an active treaty between the Goblin Nation and the Crown of Britain, and that is not a violation of the conscience of the solicitor of your houses, which last item I will define for you on request. I make a particular suggestion. The Lestrange estates were, in part, paid for by the seizure of 3 families of magical orphans during the years 1942 and 1943, by a great-uncle of the late Mr. Lestrange, who at that time held an office in the ministry, which he should not have been allowed to hold. Those 3 families have descendants. Those descendants are alive. They have, at present, no claim. The charters do not give them a claim. The charters give you a claim by inheritance of the wrong as well as the right. If you so direct, I will file, by noon today, an instrument that converts the bulk of the seized property into a trust for the descendants of those orphans, with a small remaining principal retained as a trust for the education of magical orphans generally, administered by Gringotts, with you as the Lord Patron and 3 honorary trustees of your nomination. The instrument is drafted. It awaits your signature. Harry looked at the ledger. A page had appeared, very neatly, at the top of the open ledger, that had not been on the page Bonebreaker had been showing him a minute earlier. The page was a single dense paragraph in goblin-printed legal script, with a line at the bottom for a signature, and below the line, in smaller text, 3 words that read, Trust for Orphans. I would like, Harry said in his 9-year-old voice, which was a voice he had not yet learned to use for big things and which surprised him by sounding ordinary, to sign that. Then sign, Bonebreaker said. A quill rose from the lectern and floated across the table to Harry's hand. The quill was a goose quill, sharpened to a point that did not splinter, and it had been weighted along its spine by a thin tracery of brass so that it would sit correctly in a child's hand without rolling. Harry took the quill. He looked at his name on a piece of paper for the first time he could remember. He had practiced, when Aunt Petunia was not looking, to write his name on the inside cover of an old library book Dudley had not wanted. He had written it small, in pencil, on the part of the page that no one looked at. He had written it Harry Potter twice, very carefully, and then he had erased it because he had been afraid Petunia would find it. He wrote it now. He wrote it large. Harry James Potter. The James was a name he had been told once, by a school nurse, who had told him because she had been looking at his birth records and had said, idly, "Your father's name was James, dear," and Harry had said yes, in a small voice, as though he had known, and the nurse had moved on to the next clipboard. He wrote it now, and the ink went into the parchment and stayed there, and a small bright shimmer ran along the lower margin of the page, and the page rose up off the ledger and folded itself into a precise oblong and flew, without any further instruction, through the closed door of the office and down a corridor towards a department of the bank that handled instruments of trust. "It is filed," Bonebreaker said. "By 9:30, the descendants of those 3 families will receive owls from a firm of solicitors at Gringotts informing them that they have come, this morning, into a sum of money. The Trust for the Education of Magical Orphans generally will, by noon, be receiving petitions. Reedstrike will read them with you. You will choose." Harry put the quill down. He looked at his hand. The hand had written a thing. The thing had moved through a door. The thing was, in some way he did not yet have the words for, alive in the world now, and was about to wake other things, and there was no one in any kitchen on any street in Surrey who would ever again be in a position to tell him whether he was permitted to do this. He felt, behind his eyes, the small, steady ember from the night before grow, just slightly, into something with a steadier shape. "Good," he said. It was a small word for what he meant. Bonebreaker, in the way of those who have been solicitor to a house long enough to read children, did not press him for a larger one. The Malfoy carriage arrived at the public door of Gringotts at 11 of the clock. Bonebreaker was warned by the door wraith at 11 of the clock and 4 seconds. He was not, by virtue of the warning, surprised. He had been waiting since dawn for Lucius Malfoy to be foolish enough to come in person, and he had calculated, by reference to a great deal of historical data on the habits of lords of the House of Malfoy when their political instruments had failed, that the probability of a visit in the first 8 hours had been 3 in 4. He met Lucius at the public counter. Lucius did not look like a man whose ring had cooled at dawn. He wore charcoal robes with a single silver fastening at the throat. His cane was tipped in the same silver. His hair had been combed flat and bound at the nape with a green cord that matched the lining of his cloak, and his face had been arranged into the particular blank that Lucius's father had used in the same building 40 years earlier when his own ring had cooled for 2 hours over a question of war bond underwriting. "Solicitor," Lucius said mildly. "Lord Malfoy," said Bonebreaker. "I am here," Lucius said, "to inquire after the welfare of a young gentleman." "You are not," said Bonebreaker. Lucius's smile did not move. It had been built for occasions of this kind. It was a smile that did not show the teeth and did not narrow the eyes. It sat on his face like a flat coin on a glass plate, and it stayed there. "You will permit me," Lucius said, "to differ." "You will permit me," Bonebreaker said, "to refuse the conversation." "Solicitor," Lucius said, with a faint tone now of patience being expended in front of an audience, though the audience was only the goblin behind the counter and a witch on the bench by the door who had been pretending to read a notice, and was, instead, very industriously listening. "My father, when he was a young man, conducted a great deal of family business in this hall. My father held this house in high regard. My father considered the partnership between the houses of Malfoy and the Goblin Nation a thing not to be lightly imperiled. I do not, I assure you, come to imperil it. I come to ascertain that the welfare of a child who has, in the last 18 hours, been removed from a family by an instrument signed by your colleague, the senior on duty, has been considered. Your father, said Bonebreaker, is dead. Lucius's smile did not move, but a color passed across the skin under his cheekbones, a small mottling that lasted for perhaps the time of a heartbeat and was gone. Your father, Bonebreaker said, did not, in any visit to this hall, ever once successfully prevail upon a goblin solicitor to admit him to a meeting with a minor lord of a house on a matter of ministerial politics on the morning after a charter trigger. Your father, on the 2 occasions on which he attempted this, was turned at the counter. I turned him at the counter on one of those occasions. I am turning you at the counter now. The boy is not seeing visitors today, my lord. He is not seeing visitors tomorrow. He will see visitors at his pleasure, and his pleasure has not yet been consulted on the question of you. Lucius held his cane in one hand and his gloves in the other. He did not put the gloves back on. He did not turn yet. I will leave, he said, a card. You may leave a card. He produced a card. The card was thick and creamy and had his name in raised letters above the Malfoy device. He laid it on the counter. Bonebreaker did not touch it. You will give it to him, Lucius said. I will read it, said Bonebreaker. Whether I will give it to him is a matter for my judgment of his interests, my lord. I am the solicitor of his houses. I am not the postman of yours. Lucius held the cane in one hand and the gloves in the other for 2 more seconds. Then he inclined his head, by exactly the degree that protocol required and no more, and he turned, and he went out of the hall, and at the door he met, in the manner of a corridor that has been arranged for him by a goblin clerk who is faster on her feet than she looks, a witch from the Daily Prophet who happened to be holding a notebook. The witch said, very politely, Lord Malfoy. Lucius said, more politely, I have no comment at this time. The witch wrote it down anyway. Lucius got into the carriage and was driven home. Behind him, on the goblin counter, his card lay face up. Bonebreaker, by and by, came back and turned it face down with the tip of one finger, and went back to his ledger. Reedstrike, in the meantime, had taken Harry through the morning's first quarter of formalities. They sat at the long table with the ledger between them and a fresh sheet of paper on the side. And Reedstrike, with the patience of a tutor who had been preparing children for occasions of significance since before Harry's grandfather had been weaned, walked him through 3 things. The first was the matter of names. Harry had 4 names. He had Harry, which his mother had written on every Muggle form in green ink for 2 years. He had Lord Potter, which was the name on the seat he would not sit until he was 14. He had Lord Black, which was the name on the seat which sat empty in Azkaban for as long as Sirius Black sat there without a trial. He had Lord Peveril and Lord Gryffindor, which were the names of 2 seats no house had occupied for 300 and 100 years respectively. He would be addressed differently in different rooms. He should learn to listen for the name and the room together and to answer accordingly. The second was the matter of letters. Harry would, in the coming weeks, receive letters. Some would be congratulatory, some would be solicitations, some would be threats, the clever of them dressed as congratulations. He would not open them himself. They would be opened in his presence by Reedstrike, who would mark each envelope with one of 3 small symbols at the top corner, a green dot for harmless, a yellow dot for self-interested, a red dot for hostile. He would read the green ones first, the yellow ones afterwards if he chose, and the red ones never. The red ones would be filed against the days of their writers. The third was the matter of small kindnesses. Harry was to accept small kindnesses gratefully and to remember the names of those who offered them. A man who offered a small kindness to a head of house was, in 9 cases of 10, opening a small account with the house, and in 1 case of 10 was being kind. The ratio did not, Reedstrike said, justify suspicion. It justified attention. Harry listened. Harry wrote down in the rough hand of a child who had not yet been taught to write fast the words green, yellow, and red on 3 lines of his fresh sheet, and beside them the words trust, watch, and remember. He underlined remember twice. Reedstrike, who had taught the manners of 19 lords of 9 houses across 43 years, observed the double underline and made no remark. He had observed many small things in 19 lords, and he had learned, in the same 43 years, which of the small things were worth remarking on aloud, and which were better filed in the small private journal he kept in the breast pocket of his coat. This was a filing thing. At 3 of the clock, Dumbledore came. He came without a carriage. He came on foot, which was unusual but not unheard of, and he came through the public door, and he gave his name to the door wraith with the gentle gravity of a man entering a place he respects. He was wearing his second-best robes, the ones with the moons of which the embroidery had begun, 3 years ago, to fray a little at the cuffs. He had not had the cuffs mended because he liked them slightly frayed. The slight fraying caused other wizards to underestimate the man under the robes, and he had spent 80 years not minding the underestimation. Bonebreaker met him at the counter. "Headmaster," said Bonebreaker. "Solicitor," said Dumbledore. "You may come up." It was a courtesy that had not been extended to Lucius. Dumbledore noted it in the part of his mind that always noted courtesies and did not remark on it. He had in his pocket a small bag of sherbet lemons. He did not produce them. He had judged on the walk-over that this was not a sherbet lemon meeting. They went up. Harry was at the long table, with Reedstrike beside him, and a sheaf of papers between them, and an ink pot to the left of Harry's right hand, and a glass of water to the right of his left hand, which had been refilled twice during the morning by a charm that Bonebreaker himself had laid. Reedstrike rose and bowed and withdrew. Dumbledore came forward. He stopped at the distance from the table that he used when meeting a stranger of high rank, which was 3 feet further away than the distance he used when meeting a child. He did not today mistake the difference. "My Lord Potter," he said, "I came to see how you do." Harry looked at him. Harry had heard the name Dumbledore in the wireless evenings at Privet Drive, on the lips of women in dressing gowns explaining things to other women in dressing gowns. He had not, until this moment, attached the name to a face. The face was kind. The face was old. The face had a great many small lines and one very large pair of eyes, and the eyes were blue and were, Harry understood very quickly, the part of the face that had been arranged to do most of the work. "I do well," he said. "I am glad to hear it. Please sit." Dumbledore sat. He sat in the chair that Reedstrike had vacated, which had been at Harry's left hand. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at Harry's hands. Harry's hands were small, and the nails had been cut by a goblin manicurist that morning, which Harry had thought was a strange thing to do until Reedstrike had explained, quite seriously, that the hands of a lord of 4 houses were going to be looked at by a great many people in the year to come and would do their work better if they were not bitten. "I have come," Dumbledore said, "to ask a question, and to offer a thing, and to thank you for a thing." "3 things," Harry said. He had been instructed by Reedstrike, 2 hours earlier, to count things people offered him out loud when they offered them, because it made them keep their count honest. Reedstrike had said it in the manner of an aunt telling her favorite nephew a trick at cards. 3 things, Dumbledore agreed. His eyes warmed by a degree. He liked the boy. He had not been sure he would. He had been told the boy was preternaturally quiet, and he had been afraid that the boy would have the silence of damage. The boy had a different silence. The boy had the silence of a person who was counting. "The question," Harry said. "The question is whether you would, in a year's time, accept a place at Hogwarts when your letter comes. I know you will not be 11 for nearly 2 years. I ask early because I have in my care a school which will in the coming year prepare itself differently if I know your answer differently. I would not ask you to commit, I would ask you to indicate." Harry thought. He thought for what felt to him like a long while. To Dumbledore, who had spent 80 years measuring the thinking of children, it was 4 seconds. "I will indicate," Harry said, "that I am likely to come." "That is generous of you." "The offer," Harry said. Dumbledore drew, from a deep pocket of his robe, a small flat parcel wrapped in brown paper. "My offer," he said, "is one of which you will hear different reports from different parties. I would prefer that you hear it from me. I held, for 9 years, the custodianship of a certain key. The key opened a certain vault in this building, in which there had been deposited, at various times by your father, by your mother, and by their friends, a number of items of which I will not pretend to know all the names. I held the key because your father, in a will I helped to witness, made me the trustee of the vault until you should be of age to claim it yourself. The charter that activated yesterday voids that trusteeship. The key, accordingly, has been returned this morning to the goblin clerk of the vault. I have brought you this packet, which contains the inventory of the vault as I last reviewed it, with the dates and the depositors of each item in my own hand. I have nothing further to do with the vault. I have nothing further to gain by the contents. I make you a present of the inventory. In lieu of the key I have no longer. He laid the packet on the table. Harry looked at it. He did not pick it up. Reedstrike had told him not to pick anything up that he had not been advised in advance was safe to pick up. Bonebreaker, behind Dumbledore, did not move. I will read it later, Harry said. Thank you. You are welcome. The thanks, Harry said. Dumbledore inclined his head. The thanks, he said, are for the block. I do not pretend, my lord, that the high bench is a place in which I keep no count. I have been counting for 60 years. My count this morning is short by 29 votes I had not realized I no longer possessed. 6 of those votes were votes I had been confident of. 3 of those votes I had defended in the past against accusations that they were unsound. I was wrong. The defense was wrong. The accusations were sound. I had been deceived. I had been deceived in some cases for 15 years. He paused. I came to thank you, he said, for an information I could not have purchased and could not have asked for, because if I had asked for it, I would have been told by the same 6 men that there was nothing to be found. I came to thank you for finding it without my having known to ask. Harry looked at him. Harry was 9 years old and was being thanked by an old man with bright eyes, and Harry had been thanked by older men before, in the way certain older men thank certain younger boys to make them feel they have not been beaten. This was a different thanks. Harry believed it. He said, "You are welcome." Dumbledore rose. He bowed. He did not extend a hand for shaking, because Reedstrike, when the appointment had been confirmed, had sent up a small note explaining that the boy was not, at this stage, comfortable with hands. Dumbledore had read the note and had put it in his pocket and had not crossed the room. He stopped at the door. "My lord," he said, "I will tell you one further thing, since I am here and you will hear it from someone in any case. The man who has lost the most influence in the high bench by yesterday's reading is Lord Malfoy. He will not, I think, accept his loss quietly. He will pursue, in the coming weeks, several routes by which he hopes to restore some part of his standing. One of those routes, almost certainly, will be the courtship of you. He will offer his son's friendship, the goodwill of his house, the use of his town residence for any school holiday you find inconvenient at your relatives' homes. He will not yet know that you do not have relatives' homes, and he will offer, by indirection, a great many small kindnesses. He is a clever man. He learnt his cleverness from his father, who is a clever one. I would not have you take my view of him. I would have you take your own. I tell you only that whatever else he is offering, when he offers, he is offering it because he wants something. You may decide whether the thing he wants is a thing you are willing to give." "I will decide," Harry said. "Good," said Dumbledore. He went out. Cornelius Fudge, in his office on the 2nd floor of the Ministry, that afternoon, gave a press statement. He had not wanted to give a press statement. He had wanted, very specifically, to spend the afternoon writing a letter to a friend in Falmouth who owned a holiday cottage that Cornelius had been promising himself for 3 years. He had been informed, by his senior undersecretary, that the press would gather at the front of the building at 4 whether he addressed them or not, and that not addressing them would be worse for the ministry than addressing them, and that the senior undersecretary, who was a woman of 40 named Dollars umbrage whose smile Cornelius had always found a little hard to read, would happily draft remarks for him if he so wished. He had so wished. The remarks she had drafted were 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph stated that the ministry had, on the previous morning, received notification of 47 seat voidings under a charter clause that had not, to the ministry's recollection, been activated in living memory. The second paragraph stated that the ministry, as the executive of the High Council and as the protector of the public peace, would respect the operation of the charter, would convene a special panel of 3 senior solicitors as the charter required. and would not, at this time, comment further on the identities of those affected. Cornelius read the remarks twice, said they were excellent, and asked Madame Umbridge whether he might perhaps add a third paragraph offering reassurance. Madame Umbridge said, "Of what nature, Minister?" "That the boy is being well looked after." Madame Umbridge regarded him with the same not quite treatable smile. "Minister," she said, with a small inclination of her head, "perhaps that paragraph is better left unsaid. The boy is being looked after by goblins. The public is, as the public always is, somewhat divided on the question of goblins. We do not wish to be seen as endorsing the goblins, in case the boy should turn out, in some later year, to be inconvenient. We do not wish to be seen as opposing the goblins, in case the boy should turn out to be convenient. I would not, Minister, in the absence of clearer information, recommend the third paragraph." Cornelius blinked at her several times and then nodded, and then read the 2 paragraphs aloud on the steps of the ministry at 4 of the clock, and went back inside and shut the door of his office and sat down at his desk and did not write the letter to Falmouth. He looked instead at the brass urn at his elbow. He thought of fire whiskey. He thought of the smell the brass urn had had earlier. He did not pour the fire whiskey. He sat at his desk for a long time, with his hands folded in his lap, and he thought to himself, in the small, distinct voice in which he had been thinking for some weeks now, that this was very probably the year in which his political career came to its natural close, and that he had perhaps 3 months in which to decide what to do with the close when it came. He was a corrupt man, Cornelius Fudge, and he was a small one, and he knew himself to be both, and he had, in his way, always been honest about the both. He decided he would survive the 3 months, and afterwards he would see. By the end of the day, in Bonebreaker's office, 3 more documents had been signed. The first was the conversion of the Lestrange Manor near Belper into a children's hospital, to be administered by a board of 3 healers and 1 goblin, with the building's existing wards rewritten by a goblin warding team within the fortnight, and with the first patients to be received by Christmas. The second was a proxy, by which Harry assigned the votes of his 4 seats, on all matters not involving the constitution of the houses themselves, to a panel of 3. Senior Solicitor Bonebreaker, Madame Augusta Boot of the clerk's office, and 1 further nomination which Harry left blank for the present, and which Bonebreaker did not press him to fill. The third was a request, in Harry's own hand, addressed to the headmaster of Hogwarts, asking whether it might be possible to have, sent to him by owl at his earliest convenience, a list of the books a first-year student would be required to bring to school in 2 years' time. The request was not necessary. The request was something Harry had insisted on, because he had decided, over the course of the afternoon, that he would like to know the names of the books before he knew the names of anything else. Bonebreaker had not argued. The owl went out at 7. At 8, Harry ate dinner in the room above the office. The dinner was lamb stew and bread, and there was, for the first time in his memory, a small pudding at the end of it, which had been steamed for him by a goblin kitchen witch, and which arrived on a plate of its own with a small dab of cream that had been whipped just before it was carried up. Harry ate the pudding very slowly. He was 9 years old. He had, in the course of one day, dispossessed a war criminal, founded a children's hospital, accepted the courtesy of the headmaster of Hogwarts, refused the courtesy of the most influential lord in Britain, and ordered a list of books. He sat on a chair in a stone room above a bank in London, and he ate a pudding, and he did not, when he had finished it, ask whether he might have another one. He did not need to ask. A second pudding came up at 8:30, on the goblin kitchen witch's own initiative. Harry ate it. He slept. In Wiltshire at the same hour, Lucius Malfoy did not sleep. He sat at his desk, with the cooled ring on the green leather blotter in front of him, and he wrote in his own hand a list of 3 names. The names were of 3 men in his acquaintance whose seats were not on the 47, and who could be persuaded, by various means, of the urgency of voiding the charter of the free vote on grounds of procedural irregularity. He looked at the list. He underlined the 3rd name twice. He blew out the candle. He went to bed. He had not yet begun to be afraid. He would not begin to be afraid for some weeks yet. He would never quite admit to himself that he had begun. Chapter 3. Hogwarts at 11, the clock on the platform at King's Cross had been wrong by 2 minutes since the war that had ended in 1945. The minute hand sat at 28 past 10 when the rest of the station said half past. And the porters who had been working King's Cross for 30 years had stopped trying to have it mended. Harry, 11 years old and 3 weeks into the height that put him at the shoulder of an ordinary porter, walked along the platform between Reedstrike and a young clerk of Bonebreaker's office, whose name was Coldforge, and who had been seconded to him for the day in his capacity as a lord traveling, by the standards of his short experience, between counties without a goblin household around him for the first time. He carried his own trunk. Reedstrike had insisted on this. A lord of 4 houses did not need to be seen to be unable to carry his own trunk on his own legs to his own train, even if the trunk was, in fact, weightless along the long axis, and had been weightless by a small private goblin charm since the porter at the door had set it on its trolley. The wall between platforms 9 and 10 was the color of old brick. Harry walked into it without slowing. He came out on the other side onto a platform that was the color of nothing in Surrey, and onto which there sat, steaming, the Hogwarts Express. It was a red train. He had seen the photograph in 3 different books and 1 article and 1 chocolate frog card, and the photograph had not prepared him for the color. The color was old and warm and somewhere between the color of a poppy that had been left in the sun and the color of a coin that had been kept in a pocket for a long time. The smoke rose from the funnel and curled along the underside of the iron-and glass roof of the platform and made a thin canopy of gray above the heads of the people on it. There were a great many people on it. Reedstrike, who had walked 100 lords-in-waiting through 100 first arrivals at 100 new schools across his career, paused at the edge of the platform to let Harry look. Harry looked. The people were mostly children. There were a few parents in clusters at the front of the train, where the older students traveled, and a few aunts and uncles in clusters at the rear, where the younger ones did, and there were 3 witches in the dark green of the Hogwarts staff walking up and down the train looking through the windows. There were owls and cats and 1 large copper-colored toad that had escaped a small boy on the 3rd carriage and was being pursued, with great dignity, by an older girl in a green and silver scarf. There were children also who saw Harry. He had not been seen, in this way, in his 9 and his 10 and his 11, except in the High Council chamber on 3 afternoons of his 11th year. He had been kept, by Bonebreaker, away from the cameras and the lobbies and the dining rooms of the ministry. The wizarding public had read a great deal about him in the Prophet. They had not, in 2 years, seen him in person except as a small distant figure under a goblin escort in a corridor. The platform began to know who he was in stages. A small ripple ran outward from the 3rd carriage and along the platform, the way a small ripple runs outward from a pebble in a still pool. Heads turned. Mothers turned the heads of children. The toad was forgotten. The green and silver girl looked up from her chase and slowed. A boy in a tartan scarf nudged his sister and pointed and was slapped on the back of the hand for the pointing. Harry, who had attended his first floor of the high bench 3 weeks earlier and had been stared at by 94 wizards in robes, took it without flinching. He nodded once with the inclination of head that Reedstrike had taught him to use at a public crossing. He turned to Coldforge. "My trunk," he said. Coldforge lifted the trunk onto the train. "I will be back at 5 on the Friday," Harry said to Reedstrike. "You will, my lord." "I will write on Tuesday." "You will, my lord." "Goodbye." "Goodbye, my lord." Harry got on the train. He chose the compartment at the rear of the 2nd carriage from the engine, because the compartment had no curtains drawn and the bench seat by the window was empty, and because it had 1 occupant already, a girl of about his own height with brown hair held back from her face by a plain brown clip, who was reading. The book was very thick. The book was open across the girl's lap, and her right index finger was running, at a great pace, down the right-hand margin of the page she was reading, and her lips were moving silently to the words in the way that some readers' lips do when they are reading for facts rather than for pleasure. She did not look up when Harry slid the compartment door open. He came in, he closed the door. He took the seat opposite her by the window. She turned the page. He let her finish the page. He had learned in the last 2 years that letting people finish their pages was the cheapest courtesy a lord could offer and one of the best returns on the cost. She finished the page. She closed the book on her finger. She looked up. She had brown eyes. She had a faintly upturned nose and a small mouth and a wide forehead. She did not look at his scar. She did look at his face, very precisely, in the manner of a child who has been told that meeting eyes is polite and has decided to oblige the rule. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said. "You are Lord Potter," she said. "I do not think it would be honest of me to pretend I did not know. I have read 3 accounts of your accession in the legal press and 1 in the Prophet. The legal press got more right than the Prophet. The Prophet got more right than the magazines. I am Hermione Granger. I am Muggle-born. I am 11 and 3 months. I have read all my course books and approximately 4/5 of the Wizengamot transcripts published in the last 2 years. The transcripts are publicly available in print at Flourish and Blots. I read fast." She did not say it boastfully. She said it the way a child of 11 who has, in her short life, been told a great many times that she should not display her cleverness in company, has, in the absence of company that would punish her, decided to put down her cleverness on the bench between them as an opening offer. Harry, who had not in the last 2 years been spoken to by anyone other than goblins, a great-aunt of one of the orphans on his trust, 3 healers, 2 ministry underclerks, and the headmaster, looked at her with the small, still attention he had inherited from his 9th birthday. "Hello," he said again. "Which 5th did you not read?" She had not been expecting that question. He saw that she had not been expecting it, and that he was not, by his asking, being unkind. He saw, in the small twitch at the corner of her mouth, that she had been expecting something patronizing and was, by the absence of the patronizing, somewhat off balance, and he saw also that being off balance was a state she had been kept in by other children for most of her short reading life, and that she had developed a strategy for it. The strategy was to answer the question precisely. "The 5th I did not read," she said, "was the 5th from late February to the present. The print volumes are bound quarterly, and the most recent quarterly has not yet gone to the binder. I have ordered an extract by post. It has not arrived." "It came out on Monday," Harry said. "You are sure?" "I asked my solicitor for it on Monday morning and it came up to my desk at 3. "That is the Goblin printer's run," Hermione said. "The High Street printer is a fortnight behind. They share a press, but the Goblin run has priority on the 3rd week of the quarter." "You knew that," Harry said. "I read the colophon," Hermione said, "of the book in Flourish and Blots." Harry looked at her. He looked at her the way Bonebreaker, in their first morning together, had looked at him, with a small, flat assessment that did not pretend to be anything else. "I will lend you my extract," he said, "for the journey, if you will tell me what you make of the Bednell Amendment as it was reported on page 11. Hermione's eyes lit. He saw them light. The lighting was not the lighting of a child who had been offered a sweet. The lighting was that of a child who had been offered a problem and had been told that the problem was hers to consider on equal terms. "I have an opinion of the Bednell Amendment," she said, very precisely, "and I would be glad to share it. I would also like to know whether your opinion is the opinion you held before the amendment passed or the opinion you have formed since, because I have read your speech on the amendment, and I think your speech does not quite say what your vote did." There was a silence in the compartment for perhaps 3 seconds. Harry, in the silence, made a decision. He did not announce the decision. The decision was simply made. In the way decisions are made when a person of careful habits has been waiting, for some time, for the right opportunity to make them. He decided that this girl would, by the end of the year, be the 2nd most trusted reader of his correspondence after Reedstrike, and the only one of his political readers below the age of 60. "Open the book again," he said. She opened the book. He took the extract from the inside pocket of his coat, where Reedstrike had told him to keep it, and he laid it across her knees on top of the open book. He sat back. He folded his hands. "Read it aloud," he said. "I want to know which sentences your voice slows down on. Read until I tell you to stop." She read, The train began to move at 11 of the clock exactly. Outside the window, the iron and glass roof of the platform slid by and was replaced by London, which was replaced by suburbs, which were replaced by fields. Hermione read. Harry listened. The compartment filled with the small, dry pleasure of two children who had spent too many years not being met, and who were, between 3 pages of the extract and the first cloud over Hertfordshire, beginning to be. The sorting hat had not, in 800 years, been put on the head of a sitting lord. The hall fell silent in stages, the way the platform had earlier. The silence began at the high table, where Dumbledore and McGonagall and Flitwick and Sprout had been told what to expect and had had the day to compose their faces. And it spread outward to the 4 houses on their benches, where most students had not been told and had had only the hint of rumor from the older ones to compose theirs. Harry walked up the center of the hall behind Hermione, in the line of first years that Professor McGonagall had brought through the antechamber a quarter of an hour earlier. He walked at the pace of the line. He did not slow, he did not hurry. He passed a small, dark-haired boy who had been crying in the antechamber and had stopped crying when McGonagall had touched the boy's shoulder. And he passed the green and silver girl who had been pursuing the toad earlier, who looked at him from the Slytherin bench with a look that contained, even at 11, the small, calculating attention that her house had been calibrated for. He sat on the stool when his name was called. McGonagall, who had had the day to compose her face, did not entirely succeed in composing the small twist at the corner of her mouth when she lifted the hat from the cushion. She had taught his mother. She had taught his father. She had taught his godfather. She had been told 2 months ago by the headmaster that the boy who came back would not, by the time he sat on the stool, be the boy his parents had thought he would be. She had nodded at the time. She had been thinking ever since that nodding had been the easiest thing she had done that summer. The hat went on his head. He felt it adjust. The hat was old. The hat had been the property of Godric Gryffindor, and Godric Gryffindor's line had, by the operation of the Peveril female descent that had triggered on Harry's 9th birthday, become Harry's line, and the hat knew it. The hat had known it since the moment the charter activated in the autumn that Harry had turned 9, and had been waiting in its cupboard for the boy to whose house it now belonged to come and put it on. The hat said into Harry's ear a great many things very quickly. It said, well, it said, at last, it said, I have not in 8 centuries conducted this conversation with the air of my founder. It said, do not be alarmed. It said, I have in the last 90 seconds read everything in the front of your head and approximately 1/4 of the things at the back. It said, you have come to my school as a lord and not as a boy. It said, this is by the charters my school as much as it is the headmaster's. It said, I will, if you ask, put you in the house of your founder. It said, I will, if you do not ask, put you in the house of your founder anyway, because I am the hat of Godric Gryffindor and I have not yet had the opportunity, in any of the 8 centuries of my employment, to put a sitting Lord-Heir of my own line into my own house. Harry, who had been listening with the small still attention, said, do so. The hat said, Gryffindor. The hall did not cheer. The hall did not, for 1 full second, do anything. Then the Gryffindor bench, which contained among others the eldest Weasley sons still at the school, who had been clapping for the last 7 sortings with the practiced regular clap of a prefect, began to clap, and the rest of the hall followed. Harry got off the stool. He gave the hat back to McGonagall. He walked down the center of the hall to the Gryffindor bench. He sat down on the bench at a spot 2 seats from the end, with 1 seat empty on his right, which he had left for Hermione, who had not yet been sorted and who, when she was sorted into Gryffindor also, and who, when she sat down beside him, did not say anything that was not, by some small measure, the correct thing to say. The headmaster rose at the end of the sorting and made his usual remarks, which were brief and kindly and not, by intention, particularly memorable. He looked at Harry once during the remarks. Harry looked back at him with the small, still attention. The headmaster, who had had 2 years of correspondence with Harry through Bonebreaker and 3 short interviews of his own, did not pretend that the looking was casual. After the feast, when the first years were being led to their towers by the prefects, the headmaster intercepted Harry at the door to the hall. My lord, he said, a moment. "A moment, sir. Walk with me." They walked, the headmaster and the boy, along the corridor and up a staircase that Harry had not yet been shown was there. The staircase took them to the door of the headmaster's office. The headmaster spoke the password, sugar quill, and the door opened on its spiral, and they went up. The headmaster's office had a great many small instruments on shelves, and a phoenix on a perch, and a fire that had been lit by an unseen elf in the grate. The headmaster sat at his desk. Harry sat in the chair opposite. The chair adjusted itself very slightly to Harry's height. "My lord," said the headmaster, "I have not asked you to come here to lecture you. I would not, I think, succeed. I have asked you to come here because there is a conversation I have been postponing with you for 2 years, and which I have decided will not improve by being postponed for a third. Yes, sir. You hold the proxies of 4 seats. You have, since the day after your 9th birthday, held them through a panel of 3, of whom one is Senior Solicitor Bonebreaker, one is Madam Boot of the clerk's office, and the third is a position you have left empty. I have understood for 2 years that the empty position is empty by your design. I have suspected for 2 years that you have been waiting until you reach the school before filling it. I would like to know, this evening, whether you are willing to consider me for the 3rd place." Harry sat. He looked at the fire, he looked at the phoenix, which looked at him, he looked at the headmaster's hands on the desk, which were old and quiet and folded. "No, sir," he said. The headmaster did not move. The hands did not move. The eyes did not, by any visible degree, dim. He had asked the question knowing that the probability of a yes was small. He had asked it because he had been advised, by an old friend at the ministry who was no longer in a position to advise anyone politically, that to leave the question unasked was to leave the boy in the position of having had to refuse him without the courtesy of the asking. "May I ask why?" "You may, sir." "Why?" "Because," Harry said, "if I were to give you the 3rd place, the panel would, on every close vote, decide 3-0 by Solicitor Bonebreaker first, by Madam Boot second, and by you third in the manner of those who do not wish to be the odd vote. I do not need a 3rd vote that does not differ. I do not need a 3rd vote at all, sir, on most matters. On the matters where I do, I will not, by my judgment, take it from a man who chairs a body the order of which I have, by my reading of the panel's notes, been quietly countervoting on 4 occasions this year." The phoenix made the soft chime it had made on the morning of Harry's 9th birthday. The headmaster, who had been countervoted on 3 of those occasions, and had not, until this moment, been certain that the boy understood which 3, did the smallest of inclines of the head. "Thank you for the honesty, my lord." "You are welcome, sir." "Will you," the headmaster said, after a pause in which he considered the question of whether to say anything further and decided on balance that he would, "permit me one further question of a different kind." "Yes, sir." "Will you, for the school year, treat this office as a place to which you may come when you would like to? I do not mean as a place where you must come. I mean as a place where, if a thing has happened that you would like to consider in front of a fire that is not your own, you may consider it in front of mine. I will not, while you are here, attempt to recover the 3rd place on the panel. I would value very much the use of the fire being mutual." Harry thought. He thought for 4 of his counted seconds. He looked at the phoenix again. The phoenix looked at him. "Yes, sir. Thank you. Good night, sir." "Good night, my lord." He went out. He went down the spiral. He went along the corridor and up 2 staircases, and through one passage that had a portrait at the end of it of a fat lady in a pink dress who asked him for the password. The password was Caput Draconis, which Hermione in the dormitory above had memorized in the antechamber that afternoon and had repeated to him in the compartment on the train when she had heard a prefect say it under her breath. The fat lady opened. Harry went through. He went up the boys' staircase to the dormitory. He undressed. He got into bed. He did not, for a long time, sleep. He thought of the hat. He thought of the chair in the headmaster's office that had adjusted to his height. He thought of Hermione's finger running down the right margin of the legal extract. He thought of Lucius Malfoy, who had, 3 weeks earlier, in the lower antechamber of the ministry, attempted to introduce a procedural motion of his own which had failed by 12 votes, and who had, in failing, drawn his cane very slowly across the floor on his way out in a gesture that Reedstrike had told him, in the carriage afterwards, meant the cane was promising to come back. He slept eventually. He dreamed, that first night under the roof of his founder's house, of a hand stopping half an inch from his collarbone. The first sitting of the autumn quarter was held on the second Friday of October. Harry took the long train down from Hogsmeade with Coldforge, in the manner that Reedstrike had arranged. He wore his house robes, which Reedstrike had been having let down by a tailor in Diagon Alley every 2 months as he grew. He carried, in a pocket, the Beadnell extract, with Hermione's penciled marginalia in the right margin and his own in the left. The chamber of the High Council was a long, low oak-paneled room in the basement of the ministry, with the benches set in 3 concentric horseshoes facing a raised dais on which sat the chief warlock, and beside the chief warlock, the clerk. The seats were arranged by seniority of house. The Potter seat sat in the second horseshoe, 3 from the left of the central aisle. The seats Harry held by proxy had small brass plates above them with the names of his houses. The plates had been there for 2 years. He took the Potter seat. He looked across the floor. In the first horseshoe, on the right of the aisle, sat the 11th seat in the second row of the old bench. The 11th seat was, by the operation of the charter, void. It had been void for 2 years. The brass plate above it bore the name Malfoy. Sitting in the seat at this hour, by special petition heard the previous month, was Lucius Malfoy himself, in person, attending in the capacity of an observer with no voting rights, because the panel of 3 senior solicitors had not yet ruled finally on his appeal, and because the chamber permitted the holders of voided seats to attend their seats in observation while their appeals were pending, in the courtesy of the body. Lucius looked at Harry. Harry looked at Lucius. They had not, in the 2 years and 3 months since the charter triggered, met in person. Lucius had visited the building above his head a dozen times, on a dozen pretexts. Bonebreaker had turned him at the counter a dozen times. Harry had read each of Lucius's letters, each of his cards, each of his very small kindnesses. Reedstrike had marked them all in yellow at the corner, except for the one in the second autumn which had been marked in red and which had asked, in a tone of very smooth concern, whether Harry might consider the use of the Malfoy town residence for the Christmas holiday. In the chamber, this afternoon, Lucius's face was the same face he had carried out of Gringotts in the first morning. The smile sat on it like a flat coin on a glass plate. "My Lord Potter," he said, in the small, dry voice that members were permitted to use in the chamber between sittings before the gavel. "Lord Malfoy," Harry said evenly, "it has been some time." "It has. I observe," Lucius said, "that you have come down for the procedural reading." "I have. You are aware," Lucius said, "that the reading concerns the question of roll call voting on capital matters." "I am." "I would," Lucius said, with the small, dry voice now in the lower register that he used for what he intended to be confidences, "have very much liked to have had an opportunity, before today, to share with you my own thoughts on the question. My father was a believer in private votes, my lord, on matters of capital, on the grounds that public roll calls in those cases expose the members to retribution from interested parties. I had hoped to—" "Your father," said Harry, in the small, still voice he had been practicing for 2 years and which he had not, until this afternoon, had occasion to use across an aisle to the man across from him, voted in favor of the Capital Voting Privacy Act of 1956 because he was, at the time, taking direct instruction from Gellert Grindelwald's surviving political network. I have the relevant correspondence in transcript at home. I read it on Wednesday last. I am not, my lord, persuaded by the argument from filial precedent." Lucius's smile did not move. The mottling under his cheekbones did. It came and went at the speed of a single heartbeat. "You are well read, my lord," he said. "I am read by Miss Granger of Gryffindor first year," Harry said. "I find, my lord, that her reading is more reliable than mine. I commend her to you." The gavel sounded above. The chief warlock called the chamber to order. Lucius leaned back in his observer's seat with the smile in place, and the cane laid across his knees, and the gloves folded in his lap, and the small, careful blank that had once made his father a feared man in this chamber turned to face the dais. The reading was conducted. The motion was put. The motion was that, on all capital matters before the High Council henceforth, the vote should be conducted by public roll call, the vote of each member to be recorded by the clerk, and published in the official record of the body within 48 hours of the close of the sitting. The motion was proposed by Lord Potter, of houses Potter, Black, Peveril, and Gryffindor, in his own person and by the proxies of his vacant seats, those seats being Lord Black by absence in Azkaban, and the seats of Peveril and Gryffindor being held by him as head. The motion was seconded by Madame Bones, of the House of Bones. The motion was debated for 46 minutes. 3 of the speakers were ardent in support. 2 were ardent in opposition. The rest were brief or careful, or, in the case of 3 of the members whose seats had been frozen and then reinstated after the lifting of certain marks by healer-solicitor intervention earlier in the year, very brief. Lucius did not speak. Lucius did not have a vote. The motion was put to roll call vote, in a final symmetric flourish that the chief warlock had, in private, allowed himself a small smile at when he had drafted the order paper that morning. The vote was 43 in favor, 18 against, 6 abstaining. The motion carried. The gavel sounded. In the second horseshoe, 3 from the left of the central aisle, Harry put his quill back in his pocket. He had not, in any previous sitting, taken the quill out. He had taken it out, this afternoon, for the moment of his own vote, because he had decided he would like to remember the feel of writing his name on the roll for the first capital procedure motion of his career as a sitting lord, and because he had, in the cupboard at Privet Drive, never owned a pen. He wrote Potter on the roll paper that Madame Boot had laid at his elbow. He blotted it. He passed the paper down. Across the aisle, Lucius Malfoy gathered his gloves, gathered his cane, and rose from the observer's seat. He inclined his head, by the degree of protocol and no more, to no one in particular, and he went out by the side door. His son Draco was waiting for him in the corridor. His son Draco said, in a voice that was younger than he wanted it to be, "Father, did you?" His father very quietly said, "Not in the corridor, Draco." His son Draco closed his mouth. They walked. At the top of the stairs, Lucius paused. He looked back once through the small grille of the side door into the chamber. He could see, from where he stood, only the back of Harry Potter's head, and the slim shoulders, and the small movement of the right arm as the boy passed the roll paper down. He turned. He went out. In the corridor afterwards, Draco said again, "Father, did you—" "Be quiet, Draco." Draco was quiet. That night in the Gryffindor dormitory, Harry wrote 2 letters. The first was to Reedstrike, reporting on the sitting in 3 exact paragraphs, by the form that Reedstrike had taught him for routine intelligence dispatches. The second was a note, very short, folded once, addressed in Harry's own hand to Miss Hermione Jean Granger, Gryffindor first year. Deliverable by direct passage of the folded note from one bed to the adjacent staircase across the common room, and up the girls' stair by way of a small enchanted parchment folder that he had bought in Diagon Alley. The note read, "They voted 43 to 18. Your underline on page 11 won the vote at sentence 2. Thank you." He sealed the note. He sent it. Across the dormitory, Ron Weasley, who had been Harry's bedmate by chance of arrangement and who had spent the first 6 weeks of the term in a state of cautious admiration of the boy in the next bed, looked up from the chocolate frog he was eating and said, "You sending another note to Granger?" "I am. You know she's just downstairs." "You could walk down and tell her." "I know, you always send the note." "I always do." Ron, who was not, by his own report, a clever boy, was clever enough to know when a piece of practice had a reason behind it that he did not need to understand to respect. He said, "Right, then," and went back to his frog. Harry put his head on the pillow. The hat had been in his head 3 months earlier. The hat had said, among the other things, the small thing it had said at the end, which was, "Do not be alone in this." The hat had said it as it was lifted from his head, and had been said, by the magic of the hat, only into the inside of his ear, and had not been heard by any of the witches at the high table. He had heard it. He had not in 2 years been less alone than he was tonight, with Hermione's penciled underline on page 11 still bright in his memory, and Ron's chocolate frog still smacking in the next bed, and the lights along the dormitory dimming, one, by the curfew charm. He slept. He did not dream of the hand half an inch from his collarbone. He dreamed of the roll paper passing down. He dreamed, faintly, of his name on it, in his own handwriting, in the ordinary script of a child who had learned to write his name in pencil in the inside of an old library book, and was now writing it in ink on a public roll of the council of his country. And he dreamed that the dream was, in its own way, also a kind of victory. Outside the window of the tower, the wind blew. The first owl of the night shift came in from the owlery and went out toward the south, carrying a letter in a hand that the boy's enemies, by the end of the week, would have learned to fear. Chapter 4. Lucius Falls. The bill came in on a Thursday in February. Harry was in second year, 12 years old, slightly taller than he had been at the start of term and slightly thinner, because he had been training daily through the Christmas holidays with a goblin instructor of dueling whose name was Grindstone, and whose theory of physical conditioning began with the proposition that a lord of 4 houses ought not, at any age over 10, to be the slowest body in his own room. The bill arrived at the school on the morning owl. It was addressed to Lord Potter, Gryffindor Tower, by the small, severe hand of the clerk's office. It was a copy. The original had been laid on the Chief Warlock's desk the previous evening. The cover page bore 3 lines of text: a bill for the protection of magical privacy in the operation of the Charter of the Free Vote, proposed by Lord Malfoy of Wiltshire, observer status, by special petition of the Chamber, supported in proposition by Lord Yaxley of Norwich and Lord Greengrass of the House of Greengrass. First reading, 14 February 1993. Harry read the cover at breakfast. He drank tea. He passed the bill across the table to Hermione, who had not, by this point, missed a session of his political reading in 17 months. Hermione took it. She wiped her fingers on a serviette. She opened the cover. "The argument," Harry said, "in 1 sentence." "Wait," Hermione said. She read. It took her, for 13 pages of dense print, 4.5 minutes. She read with the small, fast lip movement of her early reading and the right index finger moving down the right margin. He had, in the 18 months since the train, watched her index finger run down the right margins of 911 pages of legal print, and he had not yet seen her finger slow down on a sentence she did not already understand. It slowed on page 11. She read page 11. She turned to page 12. She read page 12. She turned to 13 and read it. She closed the bill on the inside of the back cover. "In 1 sentence," she said. "In 1 sentence. They are arguing," Hermione said, in the precise voice she had been using for the last 18 months for matters of fact, that the auto-detection of magical coercion by the activation magic of a Lord-Heir charter is a form of magical surveillance which, by the European Wizarding Accord of 1957 and the British Charter of Magical Liberties of 1973, may not be conducted without the consent of the surveilled or the special authorization of a panel of 3 senior solicitors hearing each instance separately. They argue that the Charter of the Free Vote ought to be amended to require, going forward, such a panel review before any seat may be frozen. They argue that the panel review ought to be retroactive, in the case of seats frozen by the autumn 1989 activation, by a special clause that they have drafted at clause 17 on page 11. They argue that, until each frozen seat has been individually reviewed, the seats ought to be temporarily restored to their nominal holders pending the review. They argue this is a matter of magical privacy, and not, in any sense they would care to entertain, a matter of political restoration. The drafting on clause 17 is unusually careful. The careful drafting is, by my reading, designed to ensure that the temporary restoration would last approximately 18 months while the panels conducted their separate hearings. 18 months is, by my count, 3 sittings short of the next general legislative cycle. By that cycle, the temporarily restored holders would have voted on 3 matters of substance, including the renewal of the ministerial budget for the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The renewal vote is currently expected to fall by a margin of 7 votes. The restoration would convert the margin to a Death Eater majority of 11. Harry put down his cup of tea. He looked across the hall at the Slytherin table, where Draco Malfoy was eating breakfast and pretending not to look at him. Draco had, since the autumn, made 3 small social approaches and had been refused each time with the precise courtesy that Reedstrike had drilled into Harry through the first year. He was, this morning, sitting between Pansy Parkinson and Theodore Nott, and he had a fork in one hand and a piece of toast in the other, and his eyes were not on the toast. "Hermione," Harry said. "Yes." "Draft me a rebuttal. How long do I have?" "You have until the second reading. The second reading is on the Friday after next." "That is 9 days. That is 9 days." She nodded. She picked up the bill. She slid it into the satchel at her feet. She finished her tea. She rose. "Where are you going?" Harry said. "To the library." "The library does not open until 8. "It opens for me at 7 on bill mornings," Hermione said, with the small, dry pleasure of a second year who had, over the course of the autumn, negotiated a private arrangement with Madame Pince that involved the borrowing of 3 back issues of Council Briefing per week and the return of all 3 with margins entirely unmarked. Madame Pince is sympathetic. She went. Harry watched her go. He drank the rest of his tea. He looked again at the Slytherin table. Draco's eyes were down on the toast now. The toast had not been touched. In Wiltshire that morning, Lucius Malfoy was, for the only time in 3 years, almost pleased with his correspondence. He had laid the bill on his desk the previous evening with the satisfaction of a man who had finally been able to draft, with the assistance of 3 solicitors and 1 obliging member of the Department of Magical Privacy, whose own seat sat in the 3rd horseshoe and was not on the 47, a piece of legislation that achieved by lateral move what no direct assault had achieved in 2 years. The bill did not, on its face, mention the Potter boy. The bill did not, on its face, mention the 47. The bill addressed, in the tone of a careful constitutional lawyer, a matter of magical privacy on which the boy's own goblin solicitor had, in the past, been on record as a supporter. Lucius had read Bonebreaker's old privacy opinion 4 times. He had taken the 3rd paragraph almost verbatim into his own preamble. He had taken pleasure in the taking. He had then, in the manner of a man whose father had been fond of saying that revenge was a meal best served in 3 courses, drafted the operative clauses to do precisely the opposite of what Bonebreaker's 3rd paragraph said. He was reading a letter from Yaxley. The letter was 3 sentences long. The first sentence said that Lord Yaxley had spoken, in the smoking room of his club, with 7 men whose seats had been frozen. The second sentence said that all 7 had, in their cups, indicated they would support the bill if it ever came to a vote in which their seats were temporarily restored. The third sentence said that Lord Yaxley would be at the club again on Saturday for further conversation, and that Lucius would be welcome. Lucius set the letter down. He drew a sheet of paper toward him. He uncapped his pen. He composed a reply in his best hand. Then his solicitor flew in. The solicitor's face was, this morning, the color of a man who had risen at 4 because the news had reached his office before it had reached the manor. "My lord," he said. Lucius did not look up from his pen. "Speak," he said. "The bill," the solicitor said, "has been referred this morning to the standing panel on magical privacy for an evidentiary review. That is procedural. It is procedural. It is also customary. It is customary." "Then why," Lucius said, finally looking up, "are you here at this hour?" "The standing panel," the solicitor said, "has, by an order signed at 7 this morning, accepted an evidentiary submission from the goblin solicitor of the House of Potter, who has, over the past 2 years, been compiling a portfolio of evidence relating to the Imperius enchantments laid at various times on members of the House of Greengrass, my lord." Lucius's pen, very slowly, stopped on the paper. "By whom?" he said. The solicitor did not immediately answer. "By whom were these enchantments laid?" Lucius said. "My lord," the solicitor said, "the portfolio identifies 3 enchantments. The first was laid in 1984, on Mr. Henry Greengrass, the second cousin of the present lord. The second was laid in 1986, on the Lord's younger brother. The third was laid in 1988, on the Lord's nephew. The portfolio identifies the caster of each enchantment as the same individual, identified in 3 separate cross-references by name, residence, and signature on a particular shop receipt from Borgin and Burke's dated within 48 hours of each casting. "The signature is yours, my lord." Lucius looked at the pen. The pen had, by his motion in stopping, deposited a small bead of ink on the paper at the end of the sentence he had been writing to Yaxley. He set the pen down very carefully. "The standing panel," he said, "has accepted this submission." "It has, my lord." "On the basis of what authority?" "On the basis of the standing of the Goblin Solicitor of the House of Potter to bring evidence in any Imperius matter that touches the charter of the free vote, my lord." The standing was granted by the special panel of 3 senior solicitors at the original activation in 1989. The standing has not been rescinded. The submission falls within it. "My bill is on the floor of the chamber in 9 days." "Your bill is on the floor of the chamber in 9 days, my lord." "They are timing this." "They are, my lord." Lucius rose from his desk. He walked to the window. He looked out at the lawn, which the elf had cut to a precise inch the day before. He looked at the bare cherry trees, which would, by the 2nd week of April, be in their accustomed bloom. He looked beyond the trees at the lake, which was, in February, dark and very still. He had known, in the bottom of himself, that the morning would arrive on which he would learn that the boy had, in his quiet 2 years of growing up in a Gryffindor tower under the eye of a goblin tutor, been doing more than learning his lessons. He had hoped, in the upper parts of himself, that the morning would not come until the boy was older and slower and more open to negotiation. The morning was here at the age of 12. He turned from the window. He was, by his own standards of self-discipline, composed. "I will be in the chamber," he said, on the morning of the 2nd reading. "My lord, may I?" "You may not. I will be in the chamber. I will speak to my bill. I will speak to the privacy of the magical citizens of Britain. I will speak in the voice my father used when he spoke in this chamber in 1962 on the question of the Quibblers' Reform Act. My father was correct in 1962. The chamber listened in 1962. The chamber will listen in 1993. After the speech, I will withdraw the bill, on the grounds that the matter has become entangled with a separate matter currently before the standing panel, and that I do not wish to prejudice the separate matter by the public airing of the first. The withdrawal will be reported on page 2 of the Prophet. The standing panel matter will be heard in private. The private hearing will give us 4 months in which to assemble a defense. My lord, the Greengrass signatures will be addressed in the private hearing. The solicitor did not, for a moment, say anything. "Yes, my lord." The solicitor's head withdrew from the fire. Lucius stood at the window for a further minute. He looked at the cherry trees. He looked at the lake. He did not allow himself to look at the ring on his finger, which he had, for 2 years now, worn at all times, in the manner of a man who would not concede that a thing had cooled. He went back to his desk. He picked up the pen. He looked at the bead of ink on the letter to Yaxley. He drew a clean sheet from the rack. He began the letter again in the same hand with the same first sentence. He did not finish it. The 2nd reading was on a Friday. Harry came down for it by the train, as he had come for the autumn reading with Coldforge. He wore his house robes. He carried, in the inner pocket of his coat, 2 extracts. The first was the bill itself, marked in Hermione's pencil. The second was a rebuttal, in 9 pages, drafted entirely in Hermione's hand on the parchment the school issued for 5th-year examinations, because Hermione had wanted the headings. He took the Potter seat. Lucius was in the observer's seat at the 11th place in the 2nd row of the old bench. Lucius wore charcoal robes with the same silver fastening at the throat. The cane was tipped in the same silver. The gloves were folded in the lap. The smile sat on the face the way the smile had sat in the carriage outside Gringotts 2 years and 4 months earlier. The chief warlock called the reading. Lucius rose. The chamber gave him, by courtesy, the floor. He spoke. He spoke for 31 minutes. He spoke well. He spoke, in his way, beautifully, by which it might more accurately be said that he spoke in the way his father had spoken in 1962, with the long, careful sentences and the small, precise consonants, and the trick, very nearly extinct in the British public life of the 90s, of dropping his voice on the operative words rather than raising it. He invoked privacy. He invoked the European Accord. He invoked, in a brief courteous parenthesis, his father, and the chamber, which on the whole did not love his father's memory, allowed him the parenthesis. He did not, by name or by allusion, mention the Potter boy in the second horseshoe across the aisle. When he finished, he held the chamber. He held the chamber for the time of a heartbeat. He held it a second heartbeat. Then he did, as he had told his solicitor in Wiltshire he would do, the precise next thing he had drafted that morning. And therefore, he said, in the small, dry voice now in the third register, the register of a man making a difficult announcement with grace. In light of an unrelated matter currently before the standing panel on magical privacy, in which I have, by my own application this morning, requested a private hearing on a question of personal magical history that has been raised by the goblin solicitor of the House of Potter, and which I do not wish, by the public airing of the present bill, to prejudice. I beg leave of the chamber to withdraw the bill from second reading, at this hour, with the intention of resubmission at a later sitting once the unrelated matter has been heard. I thank the chamber for its courtesy. He sat. The chief warlock, who had read the standing panel's agenda and had been told, in confidence 2 days earlier, what was in the goblin solicitor's portfolio, allowed himself the small smile he had allowed himself on the morning of the autumn motion. He turned, very politely, to the second horseshoe. Lord Potter, he said. Harry stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not, by any visible degree, take pleasure in the standing. Mr. Chief Warlock, he said, you wish to remark on the withdrawal. I do. Proceed. Harry took the rebuttal from the inside pocket of his coat. He did not open it. The bill, he said, is withdrawn on the grounds of a personal matter. The personal matter is, by the description of the bill's own proposer, a question of personal magical history before the standing panel on magical privacy. The panel has received, this morning, the goblin solicitor's portfolio, which I have read in full. The portfolio identifies 3 Imperius enchantments laid, between 1984 and 1988, on 3 members of the House of Gringotts, in the period between the public renunciation of the Death Eater cause by various of the lords here present and the resurgence of certain political activities by the same lords in the present decade. The panel will hear the portfolio in private as the proposer has requested. I will not, in this chamber, prejudice the private hearing by the public airing of the portfolio. I have one observation only. He paused. The proposer of the withdrawn bill, he said, addressed this chamber for 31 minutes on the question of magical privacy. He invoked the European Accord. He invoked the British Charter. He invoked his father. He did not, in those 31 minutes, address the central fact that the Charter of the Free Vote is not a surveillance instrument, and is not, by any honest reading of the European Accord or of the British Charter, capable of being so described. The Charter of the Free Vote is a structural protection of the chamber against the practice of magical coercion of its own members. The Charter detects coercion. It does not surveil. It detects, my Lord Chief Warlock, the way a doorframe detects a man passing through it. It does not record his face. It does not read his correspondence. It does not, in any sense the chamber would care to entertain, infringe upon the privacy of anyone who is not currently engaged in the magical coercion of an officer of this body. The proposer is, in his own person, an officer of this body. The proposer wears, beneath his cuff, a ring which has not been worn since 1989. I respectfully decline to be lectured by the proposer on the operation of the doorframe through which he has, by the Charter's reading, declined to pass. He sat. The chamber, for the length of a breath, did not respond. Then Madame Bones, in the third horseshoe, struck the floor twice with her cane, which was, in the chamber, the gesture of one member offering applause to another. 3 further canes struck the floor. Then a dozen. Then a few more, in the back benches, who had, by the small still attention they had paid for the last 2 years, been waiting for someone to put the words on the floor. Lucius did not look across. The Chief Warlock thanked Lord Potter for his remarks. The Chief Warlock recorded the withdrawal in the official rolls. The Chief Warlock referred the personal matter of Lord Malfoy to the standing panel for hearing as requested. The gavel sounded. The chamber rose. Lucius rose with it. He gathered his cane and his gloves. He walked out by the side door. His son was not, this afternoon, waiting in the corridor. The hearing of the standing panel was conducted, as Lucius had requested, in private. The hearing took 5 sittings of 3 hours each. Lucius attended each sitting in person. His solicitor attended each sitting in person. Bonebreaker, in the capacity of submitting party, attended each sitting in person. Harry did not attend. Harry was not, by the rules of the standing panel, entitled to attend. Harry received, on the morning after each sitting, a summary of the previous day's evidence in a sealed scroll delivered by Goblin Courier to the Gryffindor common room. He read each scroll with Hermione. They filed each scroll, after reading, in a small locked box that Bonebreaker had given Harry at the end of his first year, and that lived in the bottom of his trunk, and that Hermione, since the previous September, had had the key to. By the 5th sitting, the matter was settled. The panel found, in a unanimous decision delivered on the 3rd Friday in March, the following: that the signatures on the 3 relevant Borgin and Burke's receipts were the signatures of Lord Lucius Malfoy, of Wiltshire, and not of any other party. That the 3 Imperius enchantments described in the Goblin Solicitor's portfolio had, by independent corroboration of 3 separate healer solicitors instructed by the panel, been laid by the holder of those signatures upon the 3 named members of the House of Gringotts. That the casting of an Imperius enchantment upon a member of any house by a lord of any other house, for the purpose of directing or constraining the votes or political conduct of the first house, was a violation of the charter of the free vote of such severity that the seat of the casting lord, regardless of whether the casting lord's own seat had been previously frozen by the operation of the same charter, was to be voided permanently, and the casting lord, regardless of his social standing or his family history, was to be debarred from holding political office or political proxy in any chamber of the British wizarding state for the remainder of his natural life. That, in addition, the panel referred the matter to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement for criminal investigation. The panel signed the decision on Friday afternoon at 4. The decision was delivered by Goblin Courier to Wiltshire at 5. Lucius read it at the same desk at which he had drafted the bill, with the cooled ring on his finger and the bead of ink still visible, at certain angles, on the letter he had never finished to Yaxley. He did not, by Narcissa's later account, raise his voice. He folded the decision into thirds. He laid it on the desk. He rose. He walked very slowly to the cabinet behind the desk in which he kept the brandy. He poured a glass. He drank it. He poured a second glass. He drank that. He went on the 3rd glass into the corridor and along to the small parlor at the end where Narcissa was reading. He stopped in the doorway. Narcissa, who had been his wife for 15 years and who had been raised in the House of Black and who had learned, before her 20th birthday, to read her husband's posture across a room, set her book down on her lap and turned to face him. "My dear," she said, "tell me." He told her. She listened. When he had finished, she rose. She crossed the room. She kissed him once on the temple in the unself-conscious manner of a woman who had grown up among blacks and had not been taught by any of them that the kissing of one's husband at the moment of his disgrace was a thing to be done less than firmly. "Lucius," she said. "Yes." "Draco." He had not, in the 3 glasses, allowed himself to think of Draco. He nodded. "I will write to McGonagall in the morning," he said. "You will not." He looked at her. "You will write to McGonagall this evening," Narcissa said. "By owl, now. I will have a carriage waiting at the gates of Hogsmeade at 11. Draco will be on the carriage by midnight. He will be in his own bed by the morning. We will, by Monday, have decided where in France he will continue his schooling. It is the best decision available to us. I am sorry, Lucius, it is necessary." Lucius did not for a moment speak. "You are correct," he said. "I know I am. I will write the letter. Write it, I will see to the carriage. She left the room. He went back to his study. He sat at the desk. He laid a sheet of paper before him. He uncapped the pen. He wrote, in the same hand he had used on every formal letter of his adult life, a short note to the deputy headmistress of Hogwarts, requesting, on grounds of urgent family necessity, the immediate withdrawal from the school of his only son, Draco Lucius Malfoy, second year, Slytherin. He sealed the letter. He summoned an owl. The owl took the letter and went out. He sat at the desk for a further 3 hours, with the cooled ring on the blotter in front of him, and he did not, in those 3 hours, weep. He looked at the ring. He looked at the bead of ink on the unfinished letter to Yaxley. He looked, by and by, at the mantel, where the silver candelabra his father had bought in Paris in 1947 stood in its accustomed place, and he thought, in the small, distinct voice in which he had not been thinking for 2 years, that his father had been a luckier man than he was. Draco was withdrawn from Hogwarts on the Monday. McGonagall accompanied him, by carriage, to Hogsmeade at midnight on Sunday. She did not, in the carriage, lecture him. She had, in her career, accompanied 7 Slytherin boys to carriages at midnight at the request of their fathers, and she had learned, in the 7, that the lecture was not the moment. Draco did not, in the carriage, speak. At the gate of Hogsmeade, Narcissa Malfoy waited with the second carriage. She thanked McGonagall, with the precise courtesy of the House of Black, and she put her son inside, and she got in beside him, and the carriage went south. In the second-year boys' dormitory of Slytherin, Draco's bed remained made for 2 further nights, on the assumption of some of his year-mates that he might return. By Tuesday evening, the bed frame had been moved against the wall, the trunk had been removed by the house elves, and the space that Draco had occupied for a 1.5 years had been redistributed. Pansy Parkinson, in the common room, cried for 2 hours. Theodore Nott did not. Theodore Nott went up to the second-floor corridor on the Tuesday at the end of his defense against the dark arts lesson, found Harry alone at the window seat reading, sat down on the seat opposite at the polite distance that Slytherin first-years were taught to use with heads of other houses, and said, "My lord." Harry looked up. "Yes, Mr. Nott. I would like, my lord, to put on the record that my father has not, in my hearing, spoken approvingly of Lord Malfoy in 3 years. I would like, my lord, to put on the record that I had nothing to do with the matters before the panel. I am the heir of my house. I would not like, my lord, to be assumed to be the heir of the conduct of any other house. I have prepared a sworn statement to that effect, written by my own hand on the parchment of my father's seal, which I will leave with the headmaster's office tomorrow morning. I would have preferred to leave it with your solicitor, my lord. The headmaster's office, my tutor advises me, is the more conventional address." "It is. Thank you, my lord." "Mr. Nott, my lord. I do not, in my present capacity, assume the conduct of any heir from the conduct of any other house. I read the records of each house on its own. I have read your father's. He has been on the 17th place of the third horseshoe since 1979. He has voted by his own conscience on every roll call vote since the autumn of 1989 with 3 exceptions, all of which were on matters of taxation in which his vote followed his landholdings rather than his politics. I am, by the reading, content. I receive your sworn statement with thanks. I would, in the present moment, prefer to be addressed by the family name Potter, since the chamber is not in session and I am 12. Good afternoon, Mr. Nott. Good afternoon, Mr. Potter." He withdrew. Harry went back to his book. The book was a treatise on the inheritance of warding magics in long empty estates, which had been recommended to him in the autumn by Reedstrike, in preparation for the question of what to do with the second Lestrange manor in Inverness, which had been let to a tobacconist's widow, and which she had now, as of last Christmas, decided to vacate. He read. He read, very slowly, the way he had eaten the pudding in the room above Bonebreaker's office 2 3/4 years earlier, because some pleasures were better tasted long. Outside the window, the snow was beginning, very gently, to thaw on the slate of the courtyard roof. A small drip fell from the eaves and lit on the windowsill and slid, with the small bright purpose of melted snow, down the stone. Behind him, in the corridor, a school owl flew past with a letter in its claws. The letter was addressed to Lord Potter, Gryffindor Tower, in the small, severe hand of the clerk's office, and it bore the seal of the standing panel on magical privacy. The seal would not be broken until evening. The contents would not be read aloud until later. The contents, when read, would inform the boy who had read it that the Malfoy seat had been formally voided in the rolls at 4 of the clock that afternoon, that the chamber had recorded the voiding by unanimous concurrence in absentia, and that the seat would, by the operation of the charter, be retired permanently from the old bench until a new lord of the house should arise and apply in person for its restoration upon a clean record of 3 generations. Draco would, by then, be on a train south of Paris. Lucius would, by then, be at his desk in Wiltshire with the ring on the blotter and a 4th glass of brandy in his hand. The owl flew on. The boy at the window read. Cornelius Fudge, 3 floors above the standing panels chamber, learned of the decision at 4:05 by the channel he had instructed his senior undersecretary to maintain, which was the channel of a single junior clerk whose name he had not bothered to learn, and whose afternoon job, since Monday, had been to stand outside the door of the standing panel and tell Madame Umbridge what came out of it. The junior clerk arrived at the minister's outer office at 4:04. Madame Umbridge ushered the clerk in at 5 past. The clerk delivered the substance of the decision in 2 sentences by the protocol Madame Umbridge had taught him on the Monday. Cornelius listened. When the clerk had finished, Cornelius dismissed him by the small movement of the wrist that Madame Umbridge had taught Cornelius to use when he had nothing further to say to a junior. The clerk withdrew. The door closed. Cornelius looked at Madame Umbridge. Madame Umbridge looked at Cornelius. "Minister," she said, "dolors." "I would respectfully suggest," she said, with the small, not quite treatable smile, "that the minister consider, before the end of the working day, the question of where the minister was, in the matter of Lord Malfoy, in the period beginning approximately 3 years ago. The minister was, by some accounts, a guest at Wiltshire on 6 occasions during the period in question. The minister did, by the public record, accept on 2 of those occasions small ceremonial gifts of the kind that are not, strictly, declarable in the register of members' interests, but which a careful biographer of the minister might think worthy of mention. The minister will, in the present circumstances, wish to ensure that the record of those visits and gifts is clear in his own files before it becomes the subject of correspondence from any other office. Cornelius did not immediately answer. He looked at the urn on his desk. The urn had been polished by the morning charwoman. The brass shone. "Dolors," he said. "Minister, have the files brought up." "They are, as it happens, already on your desk, Minister, in the 2nd drawer on the left, in a folder I prepared on Tuesday." Cornelius blinked at her. Then he opened the 2nd drawer on the left. The folder was there. He took it out. He laid it on the desk. He thanked her with the small, dry nod of a man who had, for the 7th time in 18 months, been thanked for thanking her, and who had not yet entirely worked out whether the arrangement was sustainable. She withdrew. He read the folder. He read it twice. When he had finished, he put on his hat, instructed his secretary that he was unavailable for the rest of the afternoon, and walked, in the chill of a March evening, the half-mile to the small flat by the river in which he had lived since his wife had moved to Falmouth, and he poured himself half a glass of fire whiskey, which he did not, this evening, vomit. He drank it. He sat by the window. He watched the river. He thought, in the small, distinct voice in which he had not been thinking for some weeks, that 3 months was, perhaps, an optimistic estimate, and that he might do better to begin, on the Monday, the drafting of his letter of resignation rather than his letter to Falmouth. He decided he would do both. In the chamber that afternoon, in a small private observation at the lectern of the clerk's office, Madame Boot had, after the voiding was recorded, allowed herself, in the privacy of the lower antechamber, a smile slightly larger than the smile of 2 years earlier. She did not say anything aloud. She did not need to. Chapter 5. The Order Diminishes. The summer of 1993 was a hot one. The grass at Hogwarts had been brown since the second week of June, the lake had dropped by 1.5 inches, and the staff who remained over the holiday took to walking in the early morning, before the heat came over the forbidden forest, in straw hats they had not worn in 5 years. Harry, 13 years old, did not go to Privet Drive for the summer. He had not gone to Privet Drive in 4 summers and would not return in the next 4. He spent the first 3 weeks at Gringotts, in the room above Bonebreaker's office, and the next 3 at the cottage in Inverness that had once been the smaller Lestrange manor, and that he had, at the request of the tobacconist's widow, refitted as a kind of working country house with a study at the back and a long lawn that ran down to a private stretch of the river. On the morning of the 14th of August, Albus Dumbledore arrived at the cottage by flu. He had given 2 days' notice, as he had given 2 days' notice for every visit since the autumn of 1991. He had been received on those occasions with the small still courtesy that Harry extended to him as headmaster of the school he attended, and as a man whose work he had been, on most matters, content to read at 3 removes. He came this morning at 10 of the clock, in the sensible robes he kept for August, with his beard pinned at his collar by a small silver clasp that he had owned for 60 years, and which had not, in those 60 years, been broken. Hermione let him in. Hermione had been at the cottage since the 3rd week of July. She had her own room. She did not, when she received visitors at the door, smile at them. She nodded, with the precision she had developed for political receptions, and led them through. Dumbledore followed her along the corridor and into the study at the back. Harry was at the desk. The desk had 3 sheaves of parchment laid across it. Each sheaf was tied with a different color of ribbon. The green sheaf was the most recent week's correspondence. The yellow sheaf was the week's self-interested petitions. The red sheaf was the week's hostile communications, which had been opened by Reedstrike at Gringotts and forwarded to the cottage for filing. The red sheaf this week was unusually thick. Harry rose. He came around the desk. He did not, by Reedstrike's protocols of 2 years, extend a hand for shaking. He indicated the chair by the fire, which was unlit because of the heat but which sat in the part of the room that the morning sun was not, this hour, on, and he said, "Sir." "My lord," Dumbledore said, "you will perhaps take tea." "I will perhaps take tea, yes. Lemon, no milk, thank you." Hermione brought tea. The tea was poured by an unseen elf in the doorway and brought in by Hermione, because Harry had asked her, on the morning's first review, whether she would prefer to stay in the room for the visit or to sit in the front parlor and read. Hermione had said, "I will stay in the room." Harry had not, by any subsequent question, asked her why. The why was clear to both of them. The headmaster had asked to come on a matter relating to the block, and Hermione was, as of this summer, the second reader of the block, and the second reader did not leave the room when the block was on the table. They sat. Dumbledore drank. "My lord," he said, "I will not pretend that this is a pleasant visit. I would not, sir, expect you to. I have come to ask you for something I have not, in our acquaintance, asked you for. I have come to ask you for the release of 2 seats. He paused. 2 seats, he said, which have been frozen since the autumn of 1989. I have, in the past 4 months, conducted with the assistance of 2 healer solicitors a private examination of the holders of those seats. The examination concluded yesterday. The conclusion was that the Imperius enchantments on those 2 holders were laid by Bellatrix Lestrange in the year 1979, in the course of her tenure on the Wizarding Council of National Security, by a method that has since been outlawed, and that the healer solicitors of 1989 had not yet been trained to detect. The 2 holders have, by their own evidence and by the corroboration of the healers, been unable for the past 14 years to vote anything other than the line they were instructed to vote, and have not, in the past 14 years, been able to acknowledge to themselves that they were so instructed. The enchantments have been, in the past 4 months, lifted. The 2 holders have, in the past 3 weeks, recovered to a degree that satisfies the healer solicitors that they are now fit to resume the exercise of their own conscience. I would ask you, my lord, to consider their restoration to the rolls." Harry looked at the tea in his cup. He did not drink it. He looked after a moment at Hermione. Hermione, who had laid a notebook on her lap when they had sat down, opened the notebook. She turned 3 pages. She set the notebook on the small table at her elbow. She read aloud in the precise voice the names of 2 men. Edgar Brimley, she said. Cassius Doge. Yes, Dumbledore said. Edgar Brimley, Hermione said, voted with the order block on every roll call vote between 1971 and 1979. Voted with the Death Eater block on every roll call vote between 1979 and 1989. Voted in the period of the freezing, in writing through his solicitor, in attempts that were not counted because the seat was frozen. The attempted votes followed the Death Eater pattern in 19 out of 23. Cassius Doge, same pattern, same period, same proportions, 20 out of 24. Both of them, my Lord Headmaster, have been, by their own attempts, voting the Death Eater line throughout the freezing. The healer's opinion is that they could not acknowledge the line to themselves. They could, in fact, vote it. Yes, Dumbledore said, that is, in essence, the substance of the healer's opinion. Hermione did not, at that point, look at Harry. She did not need to. She closed the notebook. She put the notebook back on the table. Harry, who had been considering in the small, still way of his counted seconds the question of how to answer, drank, finally, his tea. He set the cup down. He looked at Dumbledore. Sir, he said, my lord. You have, in the 4 years since the activation of the Charter, restored to the rolls 13 seats by lifting the marks of their holders. I have not opposed, in any of the 13, the restoration. I have not opposed because the holders had, by the freezing, been unable to vote either line. The healers in those 13 cases were satisfied that the holders had been suspended, by the marks, from the exercise of their own conscience, and the freezing of their seats was, in their cases, the freezing of an instrument that was not being used. I supported the restoration. I voted, in each case, the affirmative. You did, my lord. In the case of Mr. Brimley and Mr. Doge, Harry said, the freezing of their seats was the freezing of an instrument that was being used. The instrument was being used to vote the Death Eater line. The instrument had been being used to vote the Death Eater line for 10 years. The healer's opinion that they could not acknowledge the line to themselves is, sir, an opinion about their inner experience. It is not an opinion about the votes that came out of their seats. The votes that came out of their seats were Death Eater votes. The freezing, in their case, sir, was the freezing of a Death Eater voting machine. I will not, sir, return the machine to the floor on the grounds that the machine, looked at from the inside, did not know it was a machine. Dumbledore was silent. He was silent in the manner of a man who had drafted, on the way from his office to the flue, the response he had expected to give, and was finding, in the small, still face of the boy across from him, that the response would not this morning serve. He drank, very slowly, the rest of his tea. My lord, he said when he had finished, I have known these 2 men for 50 years. I know, sir. They were good men in 1971. The marks they took without their knowledge. They have, in this summer, suffered very greatly in the discovery of what was done to them. I do not, sir, doubt the suffering. I do not, sir, doubt that they were good men in 1971. I would say to you, sir, that the suffering of a good man is not, in any chamber of state, an argument for the restoration of his vote to the floor of that chamber, while the question of whether his recovery is durable remains open. The 2 healer solicitors who examined them are good healer solicitors. I have read their reports. I have read their training records. The methods they used to lift the marks of Mr. Brimley and Mr. Doge have, in the literature, a recurrence rate of 17% in the first 2 years. I will not, sir, return to the floor of the chamber 2 men who have a 17% probability in the next 2 years of resuming, without their own knowledge, the Death Eater line they have been voting for 14. I will offer, sir, an alternative. Speak, my lord. The seats of Mr. Brimley and Mr. Doge, Harry said, will remain frozen by the operation of the Charter as they are. The chamber will, on the application of the healer solicitors, accept the 2 men, in their own persons, as observer attendees at every sitting, with the right to speak from the back bench, but not to vote, for the period of 2 years from the date of the healer's opinion. After 2 years, on a follow-up opinion from the same healers and a renewal opinion from a goblin solicitor of my nomination, the question of restoration may be considered. I will instruct Bonebreaker to draft, by Friday, the petition that the chamber receive them as observers. I expect, sir, by the precedent of the autumn 1989 observer arrangements, that the chamber will agree. Dumbledore looked at him. He looked at him for a long count. He looked at him with the eyes that had been arranged, for 80 years, to do most of the work. He did not, this morning, dim them. He inclined his head. "You are correct, my lord," he said, "that the observer arrangement is the right one. I had not, in the drafting of my visit, gone so far. I had been hoping for the restoration. I will accept the observer status. I will be grateful for it. I will, by the autumn, find that I am more grateful for it than I am for what I had been hoping. I thank you for the answer." "You are welcome, sir." "My lord." "Sir. You have, in this answer, refused me a thing I asked. I had thought, when I drafted the visit, that I would be more displeased by the refusal. I am not displeased. I would like, if I may, to commend very briefly the answer." "You may, sir." "It is the answer," Dumbledore said, "of a head of house. It is the answer of a head of house who has, in the 4 years since the charter activated, learned, by his goblin solicitor and by the friend at his side, and by his own conscience, the operation of his office. It is the answer of a head of house who has, by my count this morning, more authority on the floor of the chamber than I will ever have again. I do not say this in self-pity. I say it in observation. I had thought 4 years ago that you would be advised in your office badly. I am very pleased, my lord, that I was wrong." Harry inclined his head, by the degree of protocol and no more. "Sir," he said. "My lord. You are welcome to the cottage." "Thank you. I will, perhaps, take a second cup of tea." Hermione brought a second cup of tea. The diary surfaced on the 3rd of September. Ginevra Weasley, a first year, had been carrying it in her satchel for 8 days. She had, on each of those days, written in it. The writing she had done in it had been, by her own description after the matter was closed, dreamy and inattentive, in the manner of a child of 11 who had been left, by an unobservant clerk at Flourish and Blots in late August, with a notebook in the bottom of a stack of textbooks for which her family had not been able to pay full price, and who had assumed that the notebook was a part of the discount. The notebook was not. The notebook was a Horcrux. Harry, on the 3rd of September, in his third-year defense against the dark arts classroom, felt the second pull he had felt in his life behind his sternum. It was not the warm settling that had come on his 9th birthday and on every morning since. It was a cold tug. It pulled, very precisely, toward the southeast of the castle, from a position somewhere in the lower corridors below the library. It pulled with the small, distinct intention of a piece of his own magic, acknowledging the presence of a piece of another magic that knew him and did not, in the knowing, wish him well. Harry put down his quill. He went to the front of the classroom. He addressed the defense professor, a tired-eyed witch named Drinkwater, with the precise courtesy of a head of house addressing a member of staff in their professional capacity. "Professor." "Mr. Potter, I require 10 minutes. You require 10 minutes. I require 10 minutes. There is a thing in the lower corridor I would like to address. The headmaster will, by the time I return, have been notified by the wards on his office. He will, by the time I return, have arrived at the location. I will arrive there before he does. He will not need to." Drinkwater, who had taught Harry for 1 week and had not yet decided what to make of him, did the only sensible thing a tired-eyed defense professor could do in the face of a request of that kind, which was to nod once, very slightly, and to say, "Granted." Hermione was already on her feet. Harry did not, in the corridor, run. Running was, by Grindstone's coaching, the gait of a body that had not been prepared. He walked at the pace of a man whose pace he had been practicing. Hermione walked beside him. She did not, in the corridor, speak. She had felt nothing behind her sternum. She did not, by the rules of their 2-year partnership, ask Harry what he had felt. She would, by the rules, be told when the telling served. They went down 2 staircases and along the lower corridor, and through a door that had not, in 800 years, been opened by a person of correct ancestry. The door opened. In the corridor below, in a girls' washroom on the 2nd sublevel, Ginevra Weasley sat on the tile with the diary in her lap and her hand on the open page and her eyes glassy and unfocused. And the diary, which was very thin and very black, and which had, on its cover, the gilt initials TMR, was in the air above the page, projecting a small, shimmering figure of a teenage boy in school robes. The figure looked up. The figure saw Harry. The figure's face did, in the moment of the seeing, a small, precise thing that was not the calculation of a teenage boy. It was the calculation of an older mind in the body of a teenage boy. "Hello," the figure said. Harry did not answer. He drew, from the sheath that Grindstone had built for him in the previous summer, and which Reedstrike had argued, on grounds of formality, against Harry's wearing to school, and which Harry had worn anyway, the goblin-forged Peveril blade. The blade was 11 inches long. It was made of a metal that the goblin foundries had not, in 300 years, sold to any wizard, and which had been delivered to Harry on his 13th birthday by Goblin Courier in a velvet-lined case with a small printed note that read, "The property of the senior heir of the House of Peveril, returned upon his appearance, with the compliments of the foundry." The blade had been, by Reedstrike's report, used twice in its history. It had been used in the year 1281 on a lethifold, and it had been used in the year 1602 on a smaller object of the same kind as the one Harry now faced. The smaller object had, by the foundry's records, been a piece of horn carved by a wizard whose name Reedstrike had spoken once and which Harry had remembered. The figure in the air saw the blade. The figure said, "Oh." Harry put the blade through the diary. He did not need a charm. The blade did the charm. The blade was, in a sense, the charm. It had been forged by goblin smiths who had been instructed by the Peveril brother who had been clever about death, and the blade did the work that the brother had wanted the blade to do. The diary screamed. The scream lasted approximately 3/4 of a second. It rose to a high, thin pitch that the lower sublevel had not heard in 8 centuries, and which the tiles of the washroom did not, in the period of the scream, quite manage to dampen. The shimmering figure above the page guttered and went, in 3 small bright flares, out. Black ink rose, very thickly, from the slit in the diary's cover. The ink ran across the page. The ink ran over the edge of the page and onto the tile. The ink on the tile did not pool the way ink pools. It boiled gently, the way oil boils when it has been left, by inattention on a low flame for too long, and the boiling sent up a thin white smoke that smelled of the cold stone of Bonebreaker's antechamber on the morning of Harry's 9th birthday. The smoke went up the air vent. The diary, in Harry's hand, was, by the end of the boiling, a small dead thing of charred leather and white ash. He laid it on the tile. Hermione, who had been on the other side of the washroom door for the duration, came in. She looked at the diary. She looked at Ginevra Weasley, who was, by the cessation of the diary, beginning to come back into her eyes. She knelt by the girl. She put a hand on the girl's shoulder. She said, in a voice that the healers had taught her in the 2nd year for use in cases of magical fatigue, "Ginny, look at me. I am Hermione. You have had a long sleep. You are at school. You are safe. Look at me." Ginny looked at her. Ginny blinked twice. Ginny began to cry. Hermione held her. Above them, in the headmaster's office, the wards rang. The headmaster, who had been in conversation with Madame Pomfrey about the autumn restocking of the hospital wing, rose from his chair. He looked at Madame Pomfrey. Madame Pomfrey looked at him. They both, by the practice of 40 years of working in the same school, understood that the conversation about restocking was not the conversation that mattered. The headmaster came down to the lower sublevel on his phoenix. He arrived at the washroom door at 5 past the hour. He found, on the tile, a black-charred diary, a 13-year-old lord of 4 houses sheathing a Peveril blade, a Muggle-born Gryffindor 3rd year holding a Weasley 1st year on the tile, and a thin white smoke disappearing up an air vent. He said, very softly, the small word he had said, in his office, on the morning of Harry's 9th birthday. "Oh," in Azkaban, on the highest tier, in the same cell in which she had felt the cold line run up her finger on the morning of the activation, Bellatrix Lestrange heard, 3 days after the diary had been destroyed, the news of its destruction by a route she did not normally have. The root was a small, dim impression that came to her in the stone of the wall, at the place where her cheek rested when she lay on her side. The stone, in some way that the wards did not, by their old design, prevent, had passed her a piece of information that the wards had not been written to suppress. The information was that one of his pieces was gone. She sat up. She held the cold hand in front of her face. The cold had not left the finger in 4 years. The line of late had begun to creep very faintly up the bones of her wrist. She had assumed the creeping was the work of the Dementors. She understood now that the creeping was something else. "Oh," she said to the dark, "oh, but the wolf, has the clever boy eaten one of the wolf's pieces? Has he? She laughed. The laugh climbed in the 3 small ascending notes, the way it had climbed 4 years earlier, and it came out into the cell as the same sustained high sound, and the Dementor at the end of the corridor, who had grown up with the laugh and who had not, in 4 years, found a way to interrupt it, did not approach. She lay down again. She pressed the cold hand against the stone of the wall. She listened, with the cheek, for the next piece of information. It did not come. "Patience," she said to the stone. "Patience, patience, patience." The stone did not answer. The stone, she thought, was, by its long habit, a patient stone, and would tell her, in its own time, what the clever boy had next eaten of the wolf. The ritual at Little Hangleton was conducted on the night of the 31st of October. The ritual was conducted by Peter Pettigrew, who had not, in the previous 12 years, been a particularly competent caster of any spell of the 7th tier, and who succeeded that night because the body of his master had, in the months following the destruction of the diary, become, by some shifting of the patterns of soul and casing, a body that could be raised by a less competent caster than would otherwise have been required. The ritual succeeded. It succeeded biologically. Peter Pettigrew, kneeling in the wet grass in the small graveyard at the edge of the Riddle property, watched the cauldron boil over, watched the steam fold and refold itself, watched the shape of a man assemble itself out of the steam, and the bone and the blood and the small thing that had been carried in a robe across 2 continents in the previous 5 years, and watched the shape step out of the cauldron into the grass. The shape was tall. The shape was thin. The shape was bald. The shape had no nose. By the operation of the rituals it had performed upon itself in the years before its first death, and the shape had eyes the color of the inside of a cooled forge. The shape opened its mouth. The shape, in a voice that the wet grass remembered from 12 years earlier, said, "My wand." Pettigrew gave the shape its wand. The shape took the wand. The shape held the wand up to the moon. The shape said, in the Imperius sibilant voice in which it had given orders to 47 men in a clearing in this same county 13 years earlier, "Call them." Pettigrew, with the hand he had given up at the casting, touched the inside of his own forearm. The mark on the inside of his forearm, which had not been black for 12 years, went black. In 47 houses across Britain, 47 marks on 47 left forearms went black with it. Then the shape said the second word, which was the word that called them. The word traveled from the wand into the marks, and from the marks into the bones of 47 men, and the bones of 47 men in 47 houses twitched. 3 of the men were dead. 1 had died in the previous spring in his sleep. 1 had died in the summer of a fall from a horse he had been too old to ride. 1 had died in the autumn of a knife in an alley in Nocturne whose holder had never been identified. 6 of the men were in Azkaban. They felt the call. They did not, by the operation of the wards on their cells, answer it. 12 of the men were under house arrest by the operation of the standing panels referrals to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. They felt the call. Their house wards held. 11 of the men were abroad. They felt the call. They had been instructed, by Lucius Malfoy 18 months earlier, that if they ever felt the call again, they were to remain abroad, and they remained. 8 of the men were available. They came. 7 of them came to the graveyard at Little Hangleton on the night of the 31st of October. The 8th, Avery, was delayed by a horse that had slipped a shoe in the lane outside his manor and arrived at 11:30, after the others had already taken their places in the small, uneven ring. The shape looked at the ring. The ring, in 1981, had numbered 47 men in good robes, standing at the precise distances that protocol required. The ring, in 1993, was 8 men in coats of various ages, standing at distances they had forgotten the protocol for. The shape said, in the Imperius sibilant voice, "Where are the others?" Lucius Malfoy, who had come because he had had nothing left to lose by coming, but who had, by his own private decision, not put on his Death Eater robes for the journey, said, "My lord, they are in their houses." "Why are they in their houses?" "Because, my lord, their houses are warded by the Department of Magical Law Enforcement." "Because, my lord, the wards were laid on them after a public hearing of the Standing Panel on Magical Privacy, which has, in the last 4 years, lifted the marks of 13 of our number and convicted the remainder, by absentia, of conspiracy to coerce the chamber. The chamber, my lord, is no longer ours. The ministry is no longer ours. We are, my lord, 8. The shape which had not, in its previous embodied life, ever been required to count down to 8 from 47, was silent for the time of a heartbeat. "Who," it said, "has done this?" Lucius did not immediately speak. It was, in the end, Yaxley who spoke. Yaxley was old. Yaxley was not, in his old age, a careful man. Yaxley said, "My lord, it has been the Potter boy. He came of age in 1989 by an awakening of magic in his 9th year." The charter of the free vote activated under his hand. The 47 were frozen at dawn the following morning. He has, in the 4 years since, conducted a long campaign through the chamber that has voided the Malfoy seat permanently, debarred the Malfoy heir, criminalized the Imperius arts at the 7th tier, and reduced the ministry to a state in which the present minister has resigned, and his successor has not yet been confirmed by a chamber that is, my lord, very largely on the Potter boy's side. The boy is 14 on Friday. He is, by the rolls of the chamber as of last week, the political head of a coalition of 73 votes against our remaining 19. The shape, which had been very still during the recitation, did not move at the end of it. He is 14. He is 14, my lord. On Friday, the shape in the wet grass did a thing that it had not done in its previous embodied life. It looked down at its own hands. It looked at the hands the way a man looks at his hands when he is encountering them as instruments that may, in the next phase of his life, be insufficient to the task he has set them. It looked up. "I will," it said very quietly, "address this." It addressed, then, the 8 men in the ring. It addressed them at length. The address took an hour. The address was, in its way, beautiful, by the standards of the address of a wizard who had been, in his first life, by some measures the most accomplished speaker of his generation. The address invoked their fathers. The address invoked the old houses. The address invoked the year 1981 and the year 1971 and the year 1949 in which the shape had, in its first body, first addressed certain of these men's older relatives. The address did not, at any point, mention a number larger than 19. The 8 men in the ring listened. The 8 men in the ring, by various small movements of their feet on the wet grass, communicated to one another and to the shape that they had heard the address. They did not, by the end of the hour, kneel. They had knelt in 1981 at the first call. They did not in 1993 kneel. They were not, by the count of the address, certain that there were enough of them to make the kneeling, in any old sense, the right gesture. The shape did not, by the end of the hour, ask them to kneel. It dismissed them. They went. In the cottage in Inverness, at the same hour, in the long lawn that ran down to the river, Harry sat on a bench with Hermione beside him and Reedstrike standing at the discreet distance behind them. The night was clear, and the river was running, in its early November way, fast and dark. Harry had felt, 15 minutes earlier, the third pull he had felt in his life behind his sternum. The pull had been thin and very far away, and the pull had not, like the second pull, been cold. It had been the cold of a coal that had been in a cold grate for too long and had been, this evening, returned, by the breath of a man who had not yet warmed it, to a small dim red. He had not spoken for 15 minutes. He spoke now. "Reedstrike, my lord, he is back in a body. He is, my lord. How long do we have?" Reedstrike, who had been preparing the answer to that question for 4 years, said, 6 months, my lord, by the goblin estimate, 8 by the optimistic goblin estimate, 4 by the pessimistic. He will, in those months, attempt to recover the political base he had at his first fall. He will fail. He will fail because the base is no longer available. He will fail because, by the rolls of last week, the coalition that opposes him is 73 to 19. He will discover the failure in stages. He will not, in any of the stages, change strategy. He will, in the end, attempt a direct confrontation. Where? On the floor of the chamber, my lord. He has nowhere else to go. Harry nodded. He looked at the river. The river was running fast. It had been a wet October. Hermione? Yes. We will need to draft the outlaw declaration. I have a draft, Harry. Of course you do. It is in the locked box. I drafted it in the autumn of last year. Reedstrike has read it. Bonebreaker has read it. It is ready to be moved by the Chief Warlock at 24 hours notice on the Friday of any sitting week. Good. He looked at her. In the small, still way he looked at her on the occasions on which she had finished a piece of work that he had not yet asked her to begin. Hermione. Yes. Thank you. She did not answer. She did not need to. Reedstrike, behind them, looked at the river. The river was running fast, and in the fastness of it, the cold November stars were broken into 100 small bright pieces that rejoined, downstream, into the same stars over the same river going past the same bench. Hermione, on the bench beside Harry, did not look at the river. She had been looking at Harry with the small, precise attention she had been developing for 2 years, since the moment he had said her name. Harry? Yes. You will be all right. I will be all right. Good. He took her hand. He did not, by Reedstrike's protocols, take any other hand in any chamber of state. He took, on the bench by the river in the cold November dark, the hand of the friend at his side. He held it. She held back. They sat on the bench for some time more, while Reedstrike, behind them, counted, in his small private way, the number of stars that the river broke and reassembled per minute, which was a number he had been counting since 1937, and which had not, in his counting, varied by more than 2. Chapter 6. Resurrection, politically meaningless. It took 4 months. By the end of February, the shape that had risen at Little Hangleton had assembled, by the diligent recruitment of a man whose social instincts had not, in his first life, been very widely tested, 11 living adherents. The 11 were not the 11 the shape had hoped to attract. The 11 were the 11 who had been available. 6 were old men whose seats had been frozen and whose political careers had been over for 4 years. 3 were unmarked younger relations of marked men, and 2 were imports from a sister organization in Bulgaria whose grasp of the British procedural landscape was, by the shape's own report on the second week of February, deficient to the point of embarrassing. By the end of March, the shape had attempted 3 pieces of public business. The first had been a discreet approach to the new minister, Amelia Bones, who had been confirmed by the chamber in the second week of December by a vote of 78 to 19, and whose office did not return owls. The second had been a discreet approach to Cornelius Fudge in his retirement at Falmouth, which had failed when Cornelius, who had been drinking less since the resignation and reading more, had read the approach in his second sitting, and had passed it, in the same afternoon, to a goblin solicitor in London, who had passed it, in the same evening, to Bonebreaker. The third had been an attempt to recruit Severus Snape, which had failed for reasons Severus Snape declined to put into writing, and which, by Bonebreaker's later opinion, had failed because Severus Snape had, in the months following the destruction of the diary, taken a decision he had not, in the previous 12 years, been able to bring himself to take. By the second week of April, the shape had assembled, by Bonebreaker's count, 18 adherents. By the third week of April, the count had not increased. The shape, in a small dark drawing room of an Albanian forest hunting lodge to which Bulgarian connections had moved him, said on the night of the 21st of April, in the Imperius sibilant voice, "We will go to the chamber." The Bulgarian said, "My lord." Lucius Malfoy, who had been, by the shape's earlier insistence and by his own quiet exhaustion, present at the lodge for the 8 nights leading up to the decision, said, "My lord, the chamber will receive you in one capacity only. It will receive you under the outlaw declaration, which the chief warlock has had on his desk in draft form since the autumn. The moment you cross the threshold, The chamber will move the declaration. The declaration, if passed, places you outside the protection of the laws of magical Britain. After the declaration, my lord, any wizard in the chamber may, by the chamber's own warrant, attempt to kill you on the floor, and the killing will not be prosecuted. The shape looked at Lucius. The shape's eyes, the color of the inside of a cooled forge, did not move. Then, the shape said, "We will go to the chamber, and we will move first." Lucius looked at the small, dark drawing room. He looked at the 18 men in it. He looked at the Bulgarians, 2 of whom had drunk more than was wise. He looked at the shape, which had, in the 4 months since the cauldron, lost a small piece of its color around the eyes that had not been there in the 4 months following the cauldron. He said, "Yes, my lord." He did not believe a word of his own answer. He had not, since the 3rd glass of brandy on the evening of the standing panel's decision, believed any answer he had given to any question. He had given the answers because the answers were what he had been raised to give. He had given them because he had decided, on the morning of the 4th glass of brandy, that he would, by his own quiet preference, prefer to die in the chamber his father had spoken in than in a forest in Albania. The chamber was, for him, by some old measure he would not have admitted to in any earlier decade of his life, a kind of home. He had decided he would, when the time came, go home. The outlaw declaration was moved on the morning of the 28th of April, in an emergency session of the chamber convened at 6 o'clock by the chief warlock under the special procedure of the Charter of the Free Vote. The chamber was full. It was full as it had not been full since the autumn of 1989. Every seat that was not frozen was occupied. Every observer's seat that had been granted in the past 4 years was occupied. The galleries were full. The doors of the chamber had been warded by a goblin team led, in person, by Bonebreaker. The wards were of a kind that the Goblin Foundry had not erected on a public chamber of state in 200 years, and which were not, by the small private opinion of Bonebreaker, going to be breakable by any wizard alive on the morning in question. Harry took the Potter seat. He wore, this morning, the formal robes of a head of house, which had been let down by the tailor at Gringotts the previous Friday in anticipation of the height he had reached in his 14th year, and which fell, by Reedstrike's specification, to 1 inch above the floor when he stood. Hermione was not in the chamber. Hermione was, by Bonebreaker's specification and Harry's instruction, in the lower antechamber with the locked box, the draft of the declaration, the 4 versions of the speech Harry might give before the vote depending on the procedural turn the morning took, and a small leather satchel containing certain implements that Reedstrike had instructed her to keep at her side until the morning had concluded one way or the other. The chief warlock struck the gavel. The chamber rose. The chamber sat. The chief warlock called the special order. He called it in the form the Charter of the Free Vote had specified for the emergency procedure, which was the form that had been used on the morning of the activation in 1989 by the clerk's office to dispatch the 47 writs, and which was, by the procedural records, the only previous use of the special form in the records of the modern chamber. The form was, by the authority of the Charter of the Free Vote, and by the petition of the Lord of the Houses of Potter, Black, Peveril, and Gryffindor, this chamber is convened in emergency session to consider the outlaw declaration in respect of Tom Marvolo Riddle, also known as Lord Voldemort, formerly a citizen of magical Britain, presently embodied at large. The declaration is moved by Lord Potter. The declaration is seconded by Madame Bones, Minister for Magic. The chamber will hear the declaration in summary, will debate for not more than 30 minutes, and will vote by public roll call on the question. Lord Potter, you have the floor. Harry rose. He had been rising in the chamber for 2 years. He had been rising for a few minutes at a time, on procedural questions, for the past year and a half. He had not, until this morning, risen on a matter of an outlaw declaration. He spoke for 9 minutes. He spoke very quietly. He spoke, by Reedstrike's coaching of 3 years, in the small, dry voice that he had been practicing, and which the chamber, at this hour and on this matter, leaned forward to hear. He summarized the activation of the Charter in 1989. He summarized the 4 years of procedural and political consequences. He summarized the destruction of the diary at Hogwarts in September. He summarized the ritual at Little Hangleton in October by the evidence of 3 healer investigators who had visited the graveyard in November and had read what the wet grass remembered. He summarized the 4 months of attempted re-recruitment by the Shape. He summarized the 18 adherents currently in the field. He summarized the Bulgarian imports. He summarized the present hour. He concluded, "The motion before the chamber is the outlaw declaration. The declaration places, by the charter, the named individual outside the protection of the laws of magical Britain. The declaration, if passed by simple majority on a public roll call vote, is operative from the moment of the gavel. I have requested, by the petition that was lodged at 4 o'clock this morning with the clerk's office, that the chamber consider the declaration not in the abstract, but in the concrete. I have requested that, in the event that the declaration is passed, the chamber declare itself in continuous session in the Hall of Records of this building, until the matter to which the declaration refers is settled. I have requested this because, by an intelligence I received at 3 o'clock this morning from goblin sources in Albania, the named individual will, by his own choice, attempt entry to this building between the hours of 9 and 10 this morning, with the intention of conducting a procedural maneuver of his own. The intelligence is annexed to my petition. I move the declaration. Madam Bones seconds. I yield the floor." He sat. The chamber, for the length of 2 heartbeats, did not respond. Then Madam Bones rose. She spoke for 1 minute. She spoke in her capacity as minister, in the formal voice the minister was permitted to use on declarations. "I second the motion," she said. "I commend the boy for his diligence. I commend the goblin solicitor of his houses for the standing he has maintained by the work of the past 4 years on questions of the safety of this chamber. I direct the clerk to record the vote by public roll call. The vote will be conducted at the conclusion of debate. I yield." She sat. Debate was 30 minutes. There was, by the count of the clerk, no opposition speaker. There was, by the count of the goblin solicitor in the lower antechamber, no surprise in the absence. The roll call vote was taken. The vote was 81 in favor, 3 against, 2 abstaining. The 3 against were 2 old men whose seats had not been frozen by the charter in 1989, and who had been voting their conscience for 60 years, and were not, this morning, going to vote against their own conscience for any reason. The third was an heir of a smaller house whose father had been in Bulgaria for 2 days, and who had, by his own quiet decision, voted in absentia in the manner he believed his father would have wished. The gavel sounded. The declaration carried. The chamber, by Madam Bones's order, did not rise. The clerk read, into the public roll, the operative clause of the declaration. The clause named Tom Marvolo Riddle, gave the dates of his prior citizenship of magical Britain, recorded the activation of the present outlaw status, and noted that the chamber was, by the special order of the minister, in continuous session in the Hall of Records of the Ministry until further order. The chamber moved. It moved in formation. The members rose in the order of seniority of their seats and walked, by the wide double doors at the side of the chamber, into the long stone corridor that led down to the Hall of Records. The Hall of Records was a long stone room on the lower level of the ministry, 3 sublevels below the public floor, in which the original parchments of the charters of the magical state were kept in glass-fronted cabinets along the walls. The cabinets had been built in the 11th century. The parchments had been put into them on the day each charter had been signed. The hall had been used, in modern times, only for ceremonial readings of the charters on the days of their anniversaries. The hall had been chosen, for this morning, on the grounds that it was the place in the building that the wards of the ministry knew best. The wards had been written into the stone of the hall by the same goblin foundry that had, in 1281, forged the Peveril blade, and they had been renewed in 1281, in 1532, in 1689, and in 1948. They had not been renewed since. They were, by the foundry's records, fully sufficient. The chamber assembled itself. By the seating arrangement Reedstrike had drafted, in 2 long oak benches on either side of the central aisle, with the chief warlock at one end and the minister at the other. Harry took a chair at the center of the right-hand bench, 3 seats from the chief warlock. Bonebreaker took the floor at the door. The doors were sealed. The Hall of Records, for the first time in its 852-year history, contained the entire active membership of the Chamber of the Magical State of Britain, with its minister, its chief warlock, its clerk, its goblin solicitor of standing, and the bound parchments of 43 charters in one room. At 7 minutes past 9 of the clock, the shape arrived at the outer door of the ministry. It did not, by Bonebreaker's later report, attempt to disguise itself. It arrived in the robes of the 18 adherents. The adherents were behind it. Pettigrew was at the rear. The outer doors of the ministry opened. The shape entered. It walked through the public hall. It walked through the corridor that led down to the chamber of the council. It found the chamber empty. It walked through the side door. It descended the stair to the Hall of Records the way Bonebreaker had calculated by the intelligence that it would descend. It came, with 18 behind it, to the door of the Hall of Records. The door was sealed by the goblin wards of the foundry. The shape paused at the door. It read the wards. It read them, by Bonebreaker's later report, in approximately the way a literate man reads a notice in a foreign script that he can mostly make out. It understood the substance of the wards. It understood that the wards would, on contact, do certain things to anyone who was not, by the rolls of the chamber, an honored member. It understood that it would, on contact, sustain certain injuries that its present body was not, in its present body, in a condition to easily repair. It turned to Lucius. "Lord Malfoy," it said, "my lord, you have been in this chamber. Read the wards for me." Lucius read the wards. He read them, by the small, dry voice he had been using since the 3rd week of February, in the cadence of a man who had read wards in this corridor as a student of the department 40 years earlier, and who had not, in the 40 years, lost the habit. He recited the foundry's signature. He recited the renewals. He recited the operative clause. He recited, when the recitation reached it, the clause that admitted, by the special order of the chamber currently in continuous session, only those persons whose names were entered on the roll of the present session. The shape listened. "My name," the shape said, "is not on the roll, my lord. And the roll cannot be amended. The roll, my lord, can be amended only by the moving of an amendment by a sitting member of the chamber currently in continuous session. The amendment, my lord, would require a public roll call vote. The vote, on the present motion under consideration, would not, my lord, carry. The 17 of your present adherents who are sitting members of the chamber have, by the rolls of the past 4 years, been stripped of their voting rights by the operation of the Charter of the Free Vote. The single sitting member behind you who has not been stripped is Lord Goyle, whose seat is on the 17th place of the 3rd horseshoe, and who, my lord, by my reading of his face this morning, has not in the past hour decided whether he is here as your adherent or as my courier." He did not look behind him as he said it. Goyle, behind him, looked at the floor. The shape, in the corridor outside the Hall of Records, was silent for what was, by Pettigrew's later account, the longest silence of the day. When the silence broke, it broke not by speech but by motion. The shape raised its wand. It addressed the wards in the only way that, in its understanding of its present body's resources, remained available. It cast, with the wand, the unforgivable 7th-tier charm of compulsion that had, in 1981, opened the doors of the Longbottom residence and 3 other residences besides. The wards, by the foundry's design, did not open. The charm rebounded. The charm rebounded into the shape's own body. The shape, in the manner of a person who had cast the 7th-tier charm of compulsion at a wall and had had the wall return the charm to the caster, staggered. It did not fall. The body, by the cauldron's design, was not yet that fragile. The body did take, in its left side, an injury of the kind that the foundry's wards had been written in the 11th century to inflict. The injury appeared as a black line that ran from the collarbone to the bottom of the rib cage, and that did not in the next 30 seconds close. The shape steadied itself against the corridor wall. It addressed Lucius. "Lord Malfoy," it said, in the imperious sibilant voice now slightly altered by the effort of the keeping upright, I require entry. My lord. Open the door. My lord, the door cannot be opened by me. Open the door. Lucius did not, in the corridor outside the Hall of Records, draw his wand. He looked for a moment that was, by his own later account, the longest moment of his adult life at the shape. He looked at the eyes that had, in the cauldron, lost a small piece of their color. He looked at the black line. He looked at the 18 adherents behind, who had, in the time of the rebound, fallen back in 3 small involuntary steps from the shape they had come to defend. He looked at his ring. His ring, beneath his cuff, had been cold since 1989. It was, this morning, in the corridor of the ministry, on the morning of the outlaw declaration, the temperature it had always been. He looked at the door of the Hall of Records. He thought, in the small, distinct voice that had been, since the third glass on the evening of the standing panel's decision, almost the only voice he heard inside his head, that he had, this morning, the choice between 2 doors. The first was the door of the hall, behind which sat the chamber that his father had spoken in. The second was the door of the building, which led, by the corridor and the stair, back out to the lawn of his manor and the lake and the cherry trees that, by the 2nd week of April, had already entered their accustomed bloom. He chose, at last, the first. He drew his wand. He raised it. He pointed it, very precisely, at the wards on the door of the Hall of Records, in the gesture that, by the rolls of the chamber, was a member's gesture of formal request for admission. By Lucius Abraxas Malfoy, he said, formerly Lord Malfoy of Wiltshire, presently a private citizen of magical Britain, in good standing on the rolls of the ministry as of this morning's audit, by application to the chamber currently in continuous session, I request, in the public capacity of a member of the public, leave to enter. The shape, behind him, said one word. The word was Lucius's name. The shape said it in a tone the shape had not used in 1981. Lucius did not, in the corridor of the ministry, turn. The wards on the door read his application. The wards consulted, by the goblin design, the clerk's role in the hall. The clerk in the hall signaled by a small precise gesture of the wand the admission. The wards opened the door. Lucius walked in. The door closed behind him. In the corridor, the shape stood for the time of 3 heartbeats. The shape did not, in the 3 heartbeats, look at the 18 adherents. It looked, with the eyes that had, in the 4 months since the cauldron, been losing a small piece of their color, at the closed door of the hall. It said, in the Imperius sibilant voice, now in the lower register that no living person had heard it use, "Then I will come in by force." It did not, in the next 10 seconds, succeed. What the foundry had built into the wards of the Hall of Records, by the design of 1281, was a small precise instrument of summoning. The instrument did not summon anyone outside the chamber. The instrument summoned, on the occasion of a forced breach of the wards, by a named outlaw of the chamber, the senior lord of the senior house present in the hall to the door of the hall, with the right to engage the breaching outlaw at the threshold under the protections of the chamber's wards on the inside and the open corridor on the outside, in a contest that the foundry, in 1281, had been pleased to call a foundry duel. The senior house present in the hall, on the morning of the 28th of April 1994, was, by the operation of the Charter of the Free Vote and by the activation of the Peveril line, the House of Peveril. The senior lord of the House of Peveril present in the hall this morning was Harry Potter, 14, who had in the previous summer been issued by the Goblin Foundry the blade that the foundry kept for the senior heir of the senior house on its rolls. When the shape cast its second 7th-tier charm at the door, the wards summoned Harry. He rose from his chair. He came down the central aisle of the hall. He carried, in the sheath at his hip, the Peveril blade. He carried, in his right hand, his wand. He did not, at any point in the walk down the aisle, look at any face in the long oak benches on either side. He looked at the door. The door, at the appropriate signal of the wards, opened. He stepped through. The door closed behind him. In the corridor of the ministry, on the morning of the outlaw declaration, on the threshold of the Hall of Records, by the wards of the foundry of 1281, Harry Potter and the shape that had risen at Little Hangleton met in the contest the foundry had been pleased to call a foundry duel. The contest lasted 7 minutes. In the first minute, the shape was the more aggressive party, by a measure. In the second, the parties were even. In the third, the parties were even. In the fourth, the parties were even by a small new measure of which the shape in the body did not by then have a complete accounting. In the fifth, the contest turned. The shape in the corridor did not understand the turning at the moment of its happening. It would, in the long descent that followed, understand the turning by stages. The turning was that the body the shape had been given by the cauldron in October was a body that had been built out of a bone and a piece of unicorn hair, and the small thing that had been carried in a robe for 13 years. And the small thing had been built, by the original design, on a particular pattern. The pattern had been that the small thing was a piece of a soul that had been separated in 1980 from a larger whole, and the larger whole, by the operation of certain rituals laid in the previous decade, had been distributed across 7 objects, of which one had been a diary. The diary, on the 3rd of September of the previous year, had been destroyed. A piece of the whole, accordingly, had been missing on the night of the ritual. The cauldron, by its design, had not corrected for the missing piece. The body, by the cauldron's design, had been built around the gap. In the 5th minute of the foundry duel, the gap began to tell. Harry, by the design of the foundry, did not need to know the technical detail of the telling. He needed only to be, by his own preparation of the previous 4 years, the harder body in the corridor. He was. The peveril blade, in the 6th minute, came out of its sheath. The shape, by the wand, attempted 3 further charms. The third was a charm of the 8th tier that the Goblin Foundry, in 1281, had not been written to defend against, and which would, on contact, have lifted Harry from the corridor floor and put him through the wall opposite. Harry, by the coaching of Grindstone in the previous summer, did not stand in the path of the 8th tier charm. He moved very slightly to the left, and the charm went past his shoulder and into the wall opposite, where it lifted, from the wall, a panel of stone of approximately the size of a coffin lid, and put it down, very softly, on the floor of the corridor. The shape, in the moment of the casting, had committed its wand arm to the casting. Harry, in the moment of the casting, had drawn the blade. He stepped through the gap the 8th tier charm had opened in the shape's defense. He put the blade, in the manner the foundry of 1281 had built the blade for, through the lower left of the shape's ribs. The blade did the work. The shape in the corridor, for the time of one further heartbeat, attempted the Imperius sibilant voice. The voice did not come. The shape, by the cauldron's design and the diary's absence and the operation of the foundry blade, fell. It fell between 2 oak benches that had, by reed strike seating arrangement, been placed for it in the corridor outside the door for the use of certain elderly members who had not, this morning, been able to descend the stair to the Hall of Records. The benches had been moved into the corridor at 6 of the clock. They had, by 9:30, fulfilled, in addition to their stated purpose, a second purpose that the foundry of 1281 would, in a small private way, have approved. Behind the shape in the corridor, the 18 adherents had, in the 7 minutes, fallen back to the foot of the stair. Pettigrew, at the foot of the stair, ran. He did not, by the goblin team of bonebreakers at the head of the stair, run far. The 2 Bulgarians, by a precise reading of the situation that had not been available to them in any earlier moment of the morning, surrendered. 6 of the British adherents surrendered. 2 attempted to draw wands. The goblin team, by bonebreakers' deployment, addressed them. The corridor, by 9:30 of the clock, was quiet. Harry, on the floor between the 2 oak benches, knelt by the shape. He laid the peveril blade across the shape's chest, which was the foundry's protocol for the closing of a foundry duel. He took, by Reedstrike's protocol, the wand from the shape's right hand. He stood. The door of the Hall of Records opened. The chief warlock came out first. He looked at the corridor. He looked at the shape. He looked at the boy. He said, very quietly, the small word he had heard, 4 years and 7 months earlier, in the office of the headmaster of Hogwarts on the morning of the activation. "Oh!" The chamber, by the minister's order, returned to the hall and reconvened the session at 10 of the clock. The clerk recorded the closing of the outlaw declaration by the operation of the foundry duel at 23 minutes past 9. The clerk recorded the surrender of the 18 adherents. The clerk recorded the application for admission, in good standing as a private citizen, of Lucius Abraxas Malfoy. The clerk recorded the testimony, taken in the next hour, of the goblin solicitor, the chief warlock, the minister, and Lord Potter on the events of the morning. The clerk recorded at 11:30 the resolution of the chamber that the session was, by the operation of the outlaw declaration's special clause, closed. The gavel sounded. The chamber rose. Outside the door of the hall, the goblin team, by Bonebreaker's instruction, cleared the corridor. The body of the shape was, by the goblin protocol, taken to a small stone room 3 sublevels lower in the building, where it was, in the next hour, examined by 3 healer solicitors and 3 goblin pharmacists, and, by the conclusion of the examination, certified by signatures of all 6, as the body of a man who would not, by any known magical art, rise again. The Peveril blade was returned to its sheath. Harry walked up the stair to the upper corridor with Hermione beside him. Hermione had been in the lower antechamber for the entirety of the morning. She had been told, by reed strike at 25 past 9, what had happened in the corridor outside the hall. She had said, in the lower antechamber, nothing for the time of one breath, and then she had said, "I would like to see him." Reed strike had taken her up. She had not, in the upper corridor, said anything to Harry on the question of the morning. She had walked beside him. She walked beside him now. At the door of the ministry, Harry stopped. He looked at the morning. The morning was bright. The grass on the small public lawn outside the ministry, which was not yet brown by the standards of an April that had not, in 1994, been a hot one, was the color of new grass in April. He looked at his hand. The hand was not, in any way, different from the hand of his 8-year-old self at Privet Drive. The hand had grown. The hand had a fine line, very faint, along the inside of the index finger, where the Peveril blade had rested on the morning's casting. The line was not a wound. The line was the foundry's small private memorandum that the blade had been used. He looked at Hermione. "Hermione? Yes, it is over. It is over." "Good." She took his hand. She held it. They walked in the morning down the steps of the ministry to the small public lawn, and they sat on the bench at the edge of the lawn, and they did not, for some time, speak. Behind them, in the building, the clerk's office was preparing the official record of the morning for transmission to the Daily Prophet by the noon edition. Above them, by the high windows of the standing panels chamber, Madame Boot was looking down at the small public lawn. She saw, on the bench, 2 children, one of whom was the boy who had, in 1989, voided 47 seats by being thirsty. She did, in the privacy of the upper antechamber, allow herself, for the 3rd time in her career, a smile of more than 3/8 of the available extent. The smile lasted, by her count, 4 seconds. Then she rang the dispatch bell. The bell rang in the lower office. A second clerk entered. She handed him a parchment. "To the Prophet," she said. "Noon edition, above the fold." The clerk bowed. He took the parchment. He went out. The bell in the dispatch office sounded the small, precise chime it had sounded in 1989 on the morning of the writs. The chime hung in the air of the office for a moment and went out. In the small public lawn outside the ministry, on the bench at the edge, the boy and the girl sat in the April sun, and the boy, who had been ahead of 4 houses since the morning of his 9th birthday, and who had, at 14 on the morning of the 28th of April, brought to a close the war that the wizarding world had been having quietly with itself since 1971, did not, on the bench, smile. He looked at the grass. He looked in the direction in which the river ran, 2 streets away. He thought, in the small, still way he had been thinking since the morning of his 9th birthday, that he would, perhaps, in the afternoon, like a cup of tea. He told Hermione so. She rose. She went into the ministry's small public canteen. She came back with 2 cups of tea on a tray. They sat. They drank. Above them, the bells of Gringotts, 2 streets away, rang noon.